Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Laith Al-Shawaf. Laith is a researcher, psychologist, and assistant professor of psychology at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin, and was a former student of David Buss, who's also been on the podcast. His areas of specialization are evolution, emotion, cognition, along with personality and individual differences. In this episode, we talk about two of his pieces. One is 13 Misunderstandings about Natural Selection, which is the first half of this conversation. And the second half of the conversation is on his popular science piece, Should You Trust the Myers Briggs Personality Test? In this episode, we start with that first article, and we talk about evolution. We talk about how mutation is random, but natural selection is not random. We talk about really what natural selection is differential reproductive success, but that's a very long way to say that, so we say natural selection. Talk about why survival of the fittest is a misleading phrase, why there's no purpose to natural selection. Do we keep evolving, and is there genetic determinism? We talk about just so stories, the importance of ethology and evolutionary psychology. We talk about criticisms of evolutionary psychology and its function as a subcategory within psychology. We then transition to talking about his Myers Briggs article. We give an overview of the Myers Briggs. We talk about its origins with Carl Jung's analytic psychology. We give a brief overview of statistical reliability and validity, because this is important for understanding Myers Briggs. We talk about the statistical failures of the Myers Briggs test. We talk about continuous versus discrete variables, arbitrary boundaries. We also talk about why do we keep using the Myers Briggs if it's not very powerful, and if there are better alternatives, why we should use them. And then we end with, does personality change? Laith is super awesome. This was a really, really, really fun conversation for me. And really, when we got going, I probably could have kept going even longer. I really want to talk with him about his work on the evolutionary model of emotions. So it's a good excuse to get him back on here, hopefully sooner than later. Nevertheless, I'm super proud of this conversation. I feel it's absolutely important. What we talked about in terms of evolution, Myers Briggs, really, really, really good stuff. And I hope it's valuable for all you listening out there as well. So now I bring you Laith Al-Shawaf. I'm here with Laith Al-Shawaf. Laith, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Xavier.
Yeah, I've read some of your research and some of your popular pieces, and great writer, really good researcher. So maybe just briefly tell listeners who you are and what you do and what you study, and any current projects or pieces you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. My name is Laith. I'm a psychologist. I grew up in Lebanon and I did my undergrad there. I studied psychology, philosophy, and cognitive science. I then got my PhD in the States in psychology. And I teach and conduct research on emotions, personality and individual differences, and cognition, often, but not always, from an evolutionary perspective. What am I working at now? I'm based at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And I work with a great team of collaborators in many different countries on a very wide variety of things. The top one would probably be emotions, but also various aspects of cognition and cognitive biases, personality and individual differences. And we also have some cool studies going on hunger and how hunger may affect cognition and perception.
No, that's great. That's great. I know that it's like a multidisciplinary or multi-country kind of study that you do, and maybe just loosely talk about that as like a kind of a cross-cultural kind of thing that you're doing, or explain that just briefly.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not sure which one you're thinking of, but there have been a few. There was one led by Daniel Sneezer on pride, and that was a 16-country study on pride. There was one led by Aaron Sell on anger. That was a 6-country study on anger. And I've got some going on personality and on disgust that are multi-study countries or multi-country studies.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is basically to use an evolutionary perspective on disgust or anger or pride to generate some hypotheses about how it might work, including hypotheses about what contexts may upregulate or downregulate anger or pride, what the guilty party's apology might look like after he's harmed someone or mistreated someone, and then test those hypotheses in many different countries to see whether or not it's uniform across cultures or whether there is cultural variability there. And often, if there is cultural variability, if it can be predicted a priori according to theoretical principles rather than just discovered and then explained after the fact.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I don't know if I told you, when I was doing my dissertation, it was loosely on the self-conscious emotions, and then I mostly focused on shame.
Oh,
So
cool.
if you're studying shame, you have to study guilt. You have to delineate between the two. And so there was a little bit of guilt in there, but it was mostly on shame. It was empirical study, and it was a lot of fun. So I love that stuff.
That's great. Those emotions are so much fun to work on, and there's a lot of untapped stuff there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the different cultural elements is super fascinating because a lot of our stuff is always, from a Western perspective. And so kind of seeing where it goes globally and how it looks, and kind of like you were saying, is there things that are kind of uniform about it, or is there much variance? And what does that tell us about just the theoretical underpinnings of emotions? Super fascinating. There's so much stuff to kind of unearth there and all that stuff. So it's great.
Right. And I think that for many things in psychology, emotions are probably no exception. But for many things in psychology, when you study them, you find three layers. There's a universal layer that is cross-culturally uniform or invariant. And then there's going to be some differences between cultures. And then there's always going to be individual differences within a culture. And I often think about those three layers when I approach something new that I'm doing, or even when I read other people's papers. I'm often expecting to see, because this is what you see most of the time, some cross-cultural universality, some cultural differences, and some individual differences within a culture. The trick, I think, though, is to try to be able to predict some of that stuff beforehand. If you've got theoretical principles that can allow you to predict the differences between cultures, how they'll come out, or if you can predict the individual differences within a culture, then you know that you're on the right path, rather than just discovering them and then coming up with an ex post facto story to explain them.
No, that's great. Well, we'll see how far we go. Maybe we get into it, or maybe I'll save it for another time. So, but I definitely would like to get into that at some point. So, okay. So I think what will be really, really nice, really helpful, both because you've written popular pieces and some of the stuff in the literature is on evolution, which is a nice groundwork. And so as I was kind of preparing for, our talk, I was trying to keep in my mind, I always try and get at, what each of my guests, kind of areas of interest and expertise are. And then also considering, what is, I've had a handful of people on now, and we've definitely touched on evolution. And so I always want to not say the same things like 10 different times, 10 different ways. Right. But I also want to really get at the best of it. So I think one of the really nice things that you do is you explain things, very well. And a lot of your stuff is being able to synthesize, like, there's a lot of bullshit out there. There's a lot of misconceptions. And how do we kind of navigate through that kind of labyrinth? Because I think that is super important. I mean, you may feel this way, but for me in the clinical world, anytime I see clients or patients, I feel like half the time I'm just debunking and trying to say, like, no, that's not quite what that is. And that has practical implications that are potentially or inadvertently harmful. And so I definitely think this is true of evolution as well. So maybe you can just start broad brushstrokes, and then we'll kind of narrow in and talk about some of the major misconceptions. But everyone kind of knows what evolution is, I would think. But how do you usually kind of just first principles kind of explain it, and then natural selection and sexual selection and all that stuff? How do you usually kind of, what's your elevator pitch for this?
Yeah, I actually haven't developed an elevator pitch because I
No,
usually
okay.
sit down and write a long piece or talk about it in class, and so I have time to do it. But I
Mm-hmm.
guess I might start with something like the notion that evolution is random or is a chance process. A lot of people have that misconception. And by the way, I really agree with you that debunking misconceptions or misunderstandings is really important. I kind of view it as like ground zero. If you have all of these misconceptions cluttering the way you think about something, it's going to be really hard to make progress or to build an edifice on that. So you got to clear away those things first. One of the most common ones is that evolution is a chance process, or evolution is a random process. And you sometimes hear this from creationists or people who are more religious, and they say, like, I can't believe that something as complex and beautiful and exquisitely functional as the human eye could have arisen due to a chance process. But you sometimes also hear this from regular scientists who are not necessarily in biology or evolutionary psych or evolutionary anthro. They sometimes also have this notion that it's a chance process. But really what's going on is that mutations, those are random in the sense that they don't have foresight, they don't arise in order to fulfill a particular need for the organism. They can be detrimental, or they can be useful, or they can be silent and neutral. And in fact, they're more likely to be detrimental than they are to be helpful. So it's fair to say that mutations are random, but that's only the first step. And then the second step is natural selection or differential reproductive success, that some of these mutations will help organisms survive better and reproduce better, and some of them will have a detrimental effect. And by virtue of those effects, the useful ones, the helpful ones, are more likely to be passed on, and the unhelpful or detrimental ones are more likely to be filtered out. And if you think about that relationship, that's the opposite of randomness. That's a highly predictable, logical, orderly connection between the effects a mutation has and its likelihood of being passed on. Beneficial effects more likely to be passed on, detrimental less likely. So that's quintessentially non-random. That's a predictable, orderly relationship. And I think that the confusion that some folks have is that, yes, mutations are random, but natural selection is not random. And so we mustn't conflate the two. And then, so the way I would think about it is step one, mutation is random. Step two, natural selection is not random. And as a consequence, the overall process of evolution is itself not random. And so I cringe every time I hear that. I can't believe that something so beautiful or so functional could have evolved via a random process. Well, no, it couldn't have evolved via a process. I absolutely agree with you. But it's not random. Yeah. So I sometimes like to start with that one because I view it as maybe one of the most widespread.
So, that's great. So just to kind of clarify this point. So mutation is random. So maybe give an example of a mutation that we know, or we can see, or we observe, or that we understand. What would be an example of a mutation in nature?
You could perhaps have a mutation that makes a bird's wing a little misshapen so that it affects its capacity for flight in a negative way. Or if you're lucky, you can get a mutation that affects a bird's wing in a positive way that improves the aerodynamics and makes it better when it comes to flight. But the reason that I say mutation is random is that when mutations arise, they don't arise in order to help the bird. They don't think, if only the giraffe doesn't think, if only I had a longer neck, I'd be able to reach those juicy leaves. And then boom, you get a mutation that helps it accomplish that. Or the bird doesn't find itself in a predicament where flying is difficult. And so boom, like magic, it's the exact mutation it needs to help it with that. Instead, there's going to be mutations emerging with no foresight and no conception of what the organism needs or what the organism would benefit from. And because they're not tied to what the organism would like or would need, they could be helpful, they could be harmful, or they could be neutral. But once they arise, they are now going to have either no effect or a positive effect or a negative effect. And at this point, it becomes pretty predictable that the ones with positive effects are more likely to get passed on. The ones with negative effects are less likely to get passed on.
And so natural selection is not random, right? So again, maybe give an example of natural selection, maybe a common example that could be helpful to kind of delineate. As with the mutation with the bird wing, could be smaller shaped and less aerodynamic for flight, or bigger shaped and it's better for flights or it can fly faster. So that's a mutation that can happen, just like humans have mutations. We have mutations in different chromosomes, or we have different features. But what about with natural selection? What's an example of how that would look different?
Well, natural selection is really just a shorthand we use for a longer, clunkier phrase, which is differential reproductive success. Mm-hmm. Really, natural selection just means that some organisms end up reproducing more than other organisms. And so natural selection, an example of that would be, let's say that you've had some mutations arise in cheetahs that make them run faster, and some have arisen that make them run slower. Well, natural selection is the notion that those cheetahs that have those mutations that make them run faster are going to be better at catching their prey and are going to get better meals and are going to thus survive better and reproduce better. So it's simply the notion that those who were lucky enough to get the beneficial mutations are likely to do well in the survival game and the reproduction game.
And for many people, they get confused with the natural piece of it, right? So maybe talk about the natural element. Nature is doing the selecting. How is that happening?
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I think that because we call it natural selection, people tend to think that there's some kind of agent actively selecting organisms or selecting genes for inclusion into the next generation. It kind of sounds like there's a mother nature or a god or a something behind the scenes who's actively selecting.
Right.
But in reality, it's a passive process. There is no selector behind the scenes. There is no such thing as an agentic mother nature who's picking the organisms to succeed.
Right.
And really, like we said a moment ago, a better term for it would be differential reproductive success. That it kind of explains more precisely what's going on. It's simply that some organisms are reproducing more and better than other organisms. And the phrase differential reproductive success also has the virtue that it sounds kind of passive, as opposed to natural selection sounds active, like there's some agent behind the scenes doing the choosing. So differential reproductive success really is a better phrase for what's going on, but it's so clunky, so linguistically clumsy that nobody really wants to use that. So we just use natural selection, which I think is perfectly fine. Linguistic shorthands are perfectly fine. They're a good thing, as long as we keep in mind that this is kind of a metaphor. There is no active agent behind the scenes doing the selecting. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think using that shorthand is perfectly fine.
Yeah, and I think it's true for most heuristics or most shorthands or shortcuts, is that, when people start to forget what the shortcut is for, then it confabulates things and people start to kind of have it takes a life of its own. And it's like, oh yeah, nature's selecting that, this will happen, and it's not quite accurate. And so then when you think about, purpose, another misconception is that, it's all about survival, right? This survival of the fittest kind of thing. And so that's not quite true, correct? What's the more accurate way of looking at that?
Right. Yeah. So survival of the fittest kind of rolls 2 or 3 different misconceptions into one. I wish that phrase didn't exist. It's so popular and so widespread. I mean, the first thing about that phrase is that it's not really about survival in terms of the bottom line or the currency of evolution by natural selection. It's reproduction rather than survival. And I sometimes like to, when I'm teaching, when I'm talking in class, sometimes like to illustrate that in a couple different ways. One is logical and one is empirical. And the logical kind of thought experiment is, imagine you have a gene A. Gene A leads you to live to be 100 years old, but it makes you infertile. So you never have offspring, but you do live to be 100 years old. By contrast, gene B leads you to die at age 25, but it makes you have 5 offspring before you die. So you die at 25, but you have 5 kids. And then ask yourself, which of those will be better represented in the next generation, gene A or gene B? And there's really no contest. Gene A is going to be gone, and gene B, although it's sad that you died early, will be well represented in the next generation. So from a purely theoretical or logical standpoint, when reproduction and survival conflict, reproduction trumps survival. And then there's also lots of empirical examples we can see that illustrate this as well. The peacock's tail is an impediment to survival. It weighs the peacock down. It takes a ton of metabolic resources to build that tail. It's so colorful and attractive. It's like a neon sign telling predators to come
It's
here.
beautiful. It's gorgeous. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Right? And yet it's useful for reproduction. And so the peacock has it, despite the fact that it weighs it down, slows it down, and is a survival impediment. Redback spiders, male redback spiders, after copulating with a female, they offer themselves to the female to be cannibalized. And the reason they do that is that if they do offer themselves to be cannibalized, the female ends up having more offspring and healthier, more viable offspring because she gets all those good proteins and fats and nutrients from eating the male. And so he ends up doubling his paternity relative to if he had not offered himself up for cannibalization. So there's plenty of examples like that in the natural world where you can see that if the two conflict, reproduction and survival, survival takes the back seat and reproduction is the ultimate bottom line. So that's one thing about the phrase survival of the fittest. I guess the other one is that the fittest really sounds like we're talking about, who goes to the gym most or who runs the best or something like that. But as you know, and probably as many of your listeners know, really what we're talking about is the fit between an organism and its environment, the extent to which it's capable of solving problems that arise in its ecology. And so I sometimes encounter students who think that survival of the fittest really means the toughest, most muscular, strongest, fastest organism, but it doesn't. It means the organisms that best fit their environment in the sense of solving the ecological problems that they encounter in their environment.
Yeah, I think you can see this by some of the kind of the features of certain animals in certain contexts or in certain environments, right? So certain animals, they have, their ears very high above their head because they need to be able to hear because they have, they don't have peripheral vision, or there's plenty of examples in the animal kingdom of other aspects that help them to survive, quote unquote, in their surroundings. And so this idea of, at the end of the day, your first analogy is quite good between gene A and gene B. At that level, it's all about getting the genes into the next generation. I mean, this is Dawkins' whole selfish gene kind of thing or whatever, right? It's just this idea of what's going to be the best for survival in that sense. But then I guess this kind of blends into the other misconception of, well, is there like some, okay, we can agree that there's maybe no agent, there's no Mother Earth that's selecting or choosing or all this stuff, but there is a point, right? There's a final purpose, there's a goal to natural selection, and that's not quite true either.
Right. I think you're right. That's not quite true either. I think the tendency is to think that the goal or the purpose or the end point is some kind of perfect species, some kind of brilliant, intelligent, really fast, really strong, really attractive. Like we're working toward that ultimate end game of being so awesome that we have all of this great stuff. But in reality, there is no end game, there is no goal, and there is no being that has a goal in mind as it goes through the evolutionary process. Organisms, species can become more complex or they can become less complex depending on what the environment demands. It's really all about the environmental pressures that a species encounters. So for example, you have species that once were sighted, they had vision, but then they moved into a new ecology, which was a pitch black cave. And when they moved into that new ecology, they evolved to lose their vision. Yeah, exactly. Lose their sight. And so I have encountered people say, and I think this is a good question, is, okay, fine, they didn't need their sight anymore, so it didn't really help to have vision in a pitch black cave. But why did they lose it? Because it doesn't really hurt to have vision either. I think that's a really good question.
Sure.
The answer is that it actually does cost you something to build and maintain a visual system that you don't need. It costs you metabolic resources. It's neuronally expensive to build and maintain that visual system in a pitch black cave where it's accomplishing nothing. So it would be to the benefit of that species to, over time, evolve to lose that visual system so that those metabolic resources can be channeled to something else, like a better fin for swimming or better immune function, or something else that would be more beneficial than this useless sight in this pitch black cave. So, but to go back to what you were saying, this notion of, is there an end game? Is there a goal? You're right that there isn't. And a better way to think about it is that a species is driven in this direction or that, depending on what environmental pressures it encounters in its ecology. And so if the environment demands greater complexity or faster running, it may evolve in that direction. But if the environment involves, like we just said, moving into a pitch black cave and there's no need for sight anymore, then a species can evolve to become less complex, to lose an ability that they once had, simply because it's no longer useful in that environment anymore.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think kind of going from the misconceptions for a minute, I think the hardest thing for most people is, okay, I think sometimes they're good questions, but I think sometimes they're maybe not packaged in the right way. But one very, very common one is, well, if you take the kind of central locus of it, how do some species will continue to evolve and others don't? Why do some die off and they were here, the dinosaurs, let's say, or there's other species, the dodo bird, but then they die off and they're not here, or certain things like that, and so I think sometimes people will have this idea that you're always evolving and you're going to, eventually branch off into something different, but other animals, because chimps have been around for a long time, bonobos have been around for a long time, but as far as we know, they're not branching off in a way where you can see it at the moment, or they stay in one iteration for a very long time, but others will change rapidly or evolve rapidly, I should say. So sometimes people will wonder, why do some evolve into an entirely different species or subset and others don't? And what can natural selection tell us about that or not?
Well, I think you put it well when you said they're not branching off or evolving to be different in a way that we can see at the moment. Mm-hmm. Because currently it's not easy for us necessarily to see where those branches are happening. But every species that is alive is still undergoing natural selection and is still evolving. And where they will be headed is not entirely clear at the moment, but they are nonetheless still evolving and nonetheless still subject to natural selection. So bonobos and chimps included, and us included, we're still evolving. Bonobos and chimps and whales and dolphins and wolves still evolving. And you did ask, why do some species die off and others don't? I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that some species encounter a sudden, difficult, dramatic change in their environment that wipes them out, or that changes the environment so much that even if they're not wiped out, they're no longer equipped to deal with this new environment. It's more difficult to make a living there, to find food or to find a mate or to escape predators. And so why do some species die off and others keep going? A lot of that has to do with which species are subject to rapid and difficult environmental change that makes it difficult to live in this new space. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's possible that if you think about, let's say you think about evolution as a kind of design space, and the word design here doesn't necessarily imply a designer, but think of evolution as a kind of engineering design space. If you have a species that is hyper specialized, like it can only live as a parasite on or in another species, or a species that's hyper specialized in the sense that it can only eat one food, like vampire bats need the blood of other animals to survive. Some species are quite specialized in that, like that. And some species are quite generalist, like us or rats or pigs. We're omnivores. We can eat a whole range of things. We can do well in a whole range of environments. I think it's going to be harder to kill off rats or humans than it is going to be harder to kill off a species that's so hyper-specialized that it absolutely needs one kind of food or one very specific ecological niche. If they go through a disruptive change, they might be screwed. If rats or humans go through a disruptive change, they might be able to make it. So there are some regions of design space that you're more capable, if you're in there, of moving into another space and you're less stuck. And some regions where you're doing well and you're hyper specialized and you're doing great in your own ecology. But if your ecology now changes, you may not do so well in a new one. So I think that's also going to be a factor about why some species die off more than others.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's a great way in which you put that. And then I think one of the other bits that people kind of throw at evolution to try and make it come undone is like, well, what about the gaps? We don't know all the intermediary species, right? If our common ancestor with the great apes was 6 million years ago, and then we branch off and we have Australopithecus and we have Homo erectus and the different types of the Homo species. Well, we don't see all the gaps. You mean to tell me that for 2 million years there was all these changes and we haven't found all these things? Like, how do we know that was the case? How do we know it wasn't something else? And so what do you kind of say? I'm sure you've heard this whole kind of trying to put a linchpin in the whole thing with like the gaps. We don't have the intermediary species. What do you usually kind of say to stuff like that?
Well, to be honest, there's actually a lot of intermediary fossils and transition fossils, and we keep discovering more. And so there are very cool intermediate transition fish type, snake type, other fossils. I know those are not hominin, but it's important because those gaps keep getting progressively reduced. You start with, and that's the way science works, right? You start with larger gaps and then you progressively have smaller and smaller gaps. And part of the story is that there's just more transitional fossils out there than most people realize or than most people appreciate. Mm-hmm. And a part of the story is that, I think there is some truth to the notion that when we look back into history, there's just going to be some things that we can't fully settle and be 100% certain of, because there's going to be some evidence that is missing and we can't peer into history with perfect certainty. But the evidence for evolution does not come only from fossils. It comes from fossils and biochemistry and genetics and the appearance of design such that a mechanism matches the problem that it supposedly evolved to solve, and several other sources of evidence. And so this sort of like insistence on the gaps has a couple different weaknesses. One is that there's far fewer gaps than most people realize, and they progressively are becoming shortened with time. But the other one is that fossils are only one small piece of the many lines of evidence that point toward evolution being the process that has driven all living species today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we even as recent as 2015, 2017, we're finding new, even in the fossil record, and obviously genetics are just, bursting, with all the new discoveries we're making. But even in the fossil record, we're finding new fossils that are all these continuous subspecies of Australopithecus. And it's like, whoa, like here we go. Like here's another intermediary kind of species that we don't really know. And so I guess just on a few more of the pieces of the misconceptions that a lot of the times people will think that, evolution has to indicate this kind of genetic determinism, right? So you were just mentioning genetics, and that's not quite true. How do you kind of see that or chat about that?
Right. I think that's a big one. I think there's two related misconceptions. One is that evolution implies genetic determinism, and the other is that if something is evolved, we cannot change it. And these two are often tied together. Actually, there's a third that's often lumped in with these as well, which is that if something is evolved, it must be present at birth or must emerge very early in development. And all three of those are wrong. The products of evolution, adaptations and byproducts, they have a genetic basis, but they are not genetically determined. So as you know, as I know, as all life scientists know, everything in our body and brain and mind is built by genes and environment working together, right? From my nose to my personality to my toes to my religious beliefs, all of them are jointly co-determined by genes and environment. And so there is no life scientist, no evolutionary biologist, psychologist, anthropologist who thinks that these products of evolution are genetically determined. Nor does something evolved if something is evolved, it doesn't need to appear at birth. Even though in psychology, I think in the social sciences, what we often think is that evolution and learning are conflicting explanations. And if something is evolved, then it means it's present at birth. By contrast, if something emerges at age 8 or 12 or 14, that means that it's learned and cultural, not evolved. Mm-hmm. And I mean, first of all, there's plenty of things that everybody knows are products of evolution that are not present at birth. Walking is one of them. Right. Teeth is another one. Language is a good one. Facial hair. All of these things are products of evolution, but they are not present at birth. Birds, everybody knows that vision and flight are adaptations, evolved adaptations for birds, but many hatchlings can do neither. They can't see and they can't fly. And I think that part of the reason why people think this is because they say that evolution and learning are conflicting explanations for one another, for behavior, such that if you see a behavior in humans, that is either evolved or learned, but it's not both. And I think that this is a fundamental misconception, because we have plenty of things that we do that are the result of evolved learning mechanisms. That, for example, I mean, if you take monkeys, a monkey will if an observer monkey watches a target monkey being afraid of a snake, the observer monkey will learn that fear of snakes right away in a single trial. Right. But if an observer monkey watches a target monkey being afraid of something else, like bunnies or flowers, the observer monkey will not learn that fear of bunnies or flowers. And the reason why is because monkeys' brains have evolved to learn some things more easily than others. Snakes have been a recurrent threat for them, but bunnies or flowers have not. The reason I like examples like that is because that is quintessentially an evolved learning mechanism. What's going on is very clearly learning. The observer monkey is learning a fear via watching the target monkey. But it's also, why is it that it learns some things more easily than others? Because its brain has evolved to learn some things more readily than others. So that's an evolved learning mechanism. There are some other cool examples of that. Like, for example, if you get rats and a rat eats a little bit of food and then you irradiate the rat and make it sick, the rat will learn the connection between the food it ate and the subsequent sickness. But if a rat, if you show it some blue lights, flash some blue lights at it, or play some buzzer sounds at it, and then you irradiate it and get it sick, it will not learn the association between the lights and the sickness or the buzzer and the sickness. The question becomes why? Well, because in rats' ecology during their evolution, spoiled food was a real problem that sometimes led to sickness, but buzzers and lights never led to sickness. So rats' brains have evolved to learn some things more easily than others. They learn the connection between food and sickness more easily than lights and sickness or buzzers and sickness. And the reason I'm giving these examples is just to try to blow up the notion that evolution and learning are conflicting explanations, and instead insist that they are explanatory partners, and they often come together in the form of an evolved learning mechanism. And when you start thinking about things like that, language, you mentioned language, that's another good example. We learn language. We're not born speaking English and Japanese and Arabic. We learn language, but we do so via an evolved learning mechanism. Right. And everybody in the human species has this evolved learning mechanism. And then where you end up growing up in Japan or in Brazil or in Lebanon or in the States affects which language you end up learning. So the outcome of which language we speak is different, but it's driven by this evolved learning mechanism. And maybe I'm proliferating examples too much here.
No. It's great. It's not enough. I feel like sometimes people will talk about a lot of things and people can't really connect it with something, a tangible example. So that's wonderful, actually.
Okay. Yeah, great. Well, so what I see is this evolution and learning are conflicting explanations is one of the biggest problems in psychology and the social sciences, this notion that they are conflicting. And if you think that, then when you see something, when you see emotion or language, you start asking the question, is it evolved or learned? Is it learned or evolved? Mm-hmm. That's a wrong question to ask. And I was suggesting a moment ago that it's tied to those other things we were talking about. It's tied to, if it's present at birth, it's evolved. If it emerges later, it's learned. Well, and now we know that evolved and learned don't go together as competitors. They go as explanatory partners. So that's the wrong way of thinking about things. And then the last one we hadn't talked about yet, we did talk about genetic determinism being wrong, but the last in that cluster that we didn't talk about yet is the notion that if something is evolved, then it can't be changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one reason people really worry about this is because if it turns out that there's an evolved basis for aggression or warfare or something nasty that we don't want, that we want to reduce, people think, well, okay, we can't do anything about it because it's evolved. And so we just can't change it.
Right.
But all evolved things are built by genes and environment together. And all evolved mechanisms are responsive to context and responsive to the environment. So even if there is an evolved basis to aggression, or even if there is an evolved basis to something nasty that we don't like, you can still turn it down or turn it up depending on the environment or the context that you find yourself in. And so one example that my PhD advisor, David Buss, used to like to use was a physiological example, because sometimes I think people like to ground this in physiology or in other species. It makes it a little bit easier to think about rather than always talking about human.
Yeah.
So calluses, we all have callus producing mechanisms in our skin, and they are evolved physiological mechanisms that all humans have. And these callus producing mechanisms basically say, if you encounter repeated friction to the skin, produce a callus to protect the skin. And if you don't encounter repeated friction to the skin, no need to produce a callus. And so even though that's an evolved physiological mechanism, whether or not it produces calluses is totally changeable. We can modify whether or not we end up getting calluses based on the environment we encounter. If we encounter repeated friction, we get calluses. If we don't encounter repeated friction, we don't. So if you wear gloves when you work out, or if you have a job that doesn't involve a lot of friction to the skin, you don't end up getting calluses. And similarly, when it comes to psychological outcomes that we may want to reduce, it is totally possible to reduce them even if they have an evolved basis, because all evolved mechanisms are sensitive to the environment and to context. So we can turn off and on and turn up and down the products of our evolved mechanisms.
Yeah, no, that's fabulous. I also think of bipedalism as well. In certain apes, it was there for a while, and then it went away. And other animals, it was, they walk upright on 2 feet, and then it went away. And it's been a kind of feature for humans where we've done it and we keep doing it, and maybe it will go away at some point. But so sometimes things will evolve. And then it changes based on the environment. If you're up in the trees, you might not need to do as much, but then you're down on the ground. Well, you might need to learn how to, you can't be crawling on the ground, and over time, your physiology is going to change.
Right.
I guess the last one is the just so stories. I think that's might be one of the last kind of misconceptions. And then I have a few other questions about evolution, but kind of explain this piece and why it's kind of not so accurate.
Yeah, so I think the misconception is that evolutionary hypotheses in general or evolutionary psychological hypotheses are just so stories. And if we ask what is a just so story, it's a story or a hypothesis that we believe without enough evidence. Or I think more precisely, it's when you notice something, you observe a behavior, and then you concoct a convenient explanation for that behavior. In this case, you concoct a convenient evolutionary explanation for that behavior. And then you just decide to just believe that explanation on the basis of plausibility alone. It sounds good, so I'm just going to believe it. And I think that is a just so story. The issue, though, is that if you actually look at how evolutionary social scientists do their work, that is not what they do. What they often do is the opposite. They start with a theory. They use that to generate hypotheses, and then they use those hypotheses to generate specific predictions, and then they go out in the world and test those predictions. So they're not noticing a behavior, concocting an explanation for it, and then deciding to believe the explanation. They're going in the opposite direction. They're beginning with theory, generating a hypothesis, generating a prediction, and then going out and testing those predictions. So I've used some examples in the past having to do with emotions. So if you think that disgust has evolved to reduce the likelihood of infection, to protect us from disease, you might start now generating hypotheses like, well, then I bet that those who are more easily disgusted get sick less often. And I predict that people will be more disgusted by more pathogenic items rather than less pathogenic items. And I predict that people who grow up in the world, in parts of the world with more pathogens, will end up being less extroverted and less affiliative than people who grow up in regions of the world with fewer pathogens. And I predict that this disgust mechanism will be context sensitive, such that when people are assessing their own baby's feces, they find it less disgusting than other babies' feces. All of these predictions have been made and then verified. But what's important about this is that it isn't like somebody discovered these, somebody observed these findings and then created an evolutionary explanation for them. On the contrary, what happened was somebody had this evolutionary hypothesis, decided to go test it to see if it would be verified or not, and then it was supported by the evidence and a new discovery was made in the process. So that's kind of the diametric opposite of a just so story. No need for more examples. Let me instead say that even if you're doing the even if you're beginning with an observation and you're then concocting an explanation for it, even then it's possible to avoid just so storytelling. All you need to do is, after you've observed a phenomenon and concocted an explanation for it, now all you need to do is generate a new prediction on the basis of the explanation you just created, a novel prediction that has never been tested before, and then go and test it. And if you're doing that, then you are not just working backward from data to story and stopping there. That's the real danger, right? Working backward from data to story and stopping there. But if you work backward from data to story and then you use that story or hypothesis to generate a novel prediction that has never been tested before, and then you go test it, then you're just doing normal science. So all you need to do to avoid the just so story charge is you either begin with theory and proceed from there to generate hypotheses and predictions that you go test, in which case you're immune to the just so problem. Or if you do begin with an observation and then generate an explanation for it, you make sure to not stop there. You make sure to generate a novel prediction based on that hypothesis and then go test it. So that, I think, is the crux of why just so storytelling is not actually a big problem in the evolutionary sciences or the evolutionary social sciences. But why do people think that it is a problem? I have a little bit of an analysis of that. I think that the reason people think just so storytelling must be the norm in evolutionary psychology or the evolutionary social sciences is because they figure, okay, number one, behavior doesn't fossilize. Number two, all evolutionary hypotheses implicitly involve a historical element. And number three, we can't travel into the past, so we can't know with certainty what the past was like. And if you believe these three things, all evolutionary hypotheses implicitly have a historical element, we can't travel into the past or know the past with certainty, and behavior doesn't fossilize, it sounds kind of reasonable that evolutionary hypotheses must be just so stories. But there's a couple problems with this. The first problem is that in order to test an evolutionary hypothesis, you don't need to travel into the past. What you need to do is generate novel predictions about how humans would behave today if that hypothesis were true. So in the disgust example, when we said we hypothesize that disgust has evolved to protect from disease, how do you test that? You don't travel into the past. You say, well, if that's true, then I predict X, Y, and Z about modern humans, how they will behave when they encounter pathogens, how they will behave when those pathogens come from their babies versus other people's babies. And then you go and test modern humans. So the crux of the misunderstanding, I think, is that you generate an evolutionary hypothesis based partly on historical considerations, but you don't test it based on historical considerations. You test it by deriving novel predictions and testing them in the modern day with modern humans. So there's no traveling into the past needed. And I think that that is part of the crux of the misunderstanding. The other thing I think that's crucial here is that we know so much more about the past than people think. We know that our ancestors bled when they were bitten by predators. We know that they were subject to disease and that they had immune systems to fight those diseases. We know that they had color vision. We know that incest was bad for them because it led to inbreeding depression. We know that there were two sexes and that the females nursed. We know so many, those things sound kind of boring. You know, they were bipedal. All of these things sound mundane and boring, but actually each one of those things can be used to generate dozens of novel hypotheses that then we can derive novel predictions from those hypotheses and go test them. So that's the other thing that I think folks don't appreciate, is that some very quotidian, mundane, everyday facts about our ancestors, that we bled, that we had color vision, that we lived in groups, that we had to avoid incest, etc. Very mundane things like that can lead to dozens of hypotheses that become testable in the modern world. And that's my analysis of why people think that evolutionary hypotheses must automatically be just so stories, even though they're not. The one other thing I would add, sorry, I'm rambling here.
No, it's great. It's great.
The one other thing I would add is that if it were true that any historical discipline is automatically subject to all sorts of just so unfalsifiable storytelling, that would mean that all of the historical disciplines, cosmology, astrophysics, geology, paleontology, they would all be riddled with just so nonsense. Yeah. And I think that that's a kind of reductio ad absurdum for people to realize that, okay, that isn't the case. So let me take a step back and think about what a just so story really is, and whether or not the historicity or partial historicity of a discipline automatically renders its hypotheses unfalsifiable or untestable. And when you start thinking about it more deeply and along the lines that I was just suggesting, it becomes clear that partial historicity doesn't make a discipline unfalsifiable, because you don't travel into the past to test those things. You derive novel predictions that you test in the modern day.
Yeah, and I think the time machine element is doing it on modern humans, because the elements that were true for ancient humans are still within modern humans in terms of the very boring, mundane things you just listed.
Right.
And so that we have the past of sorts, or in many ways how we get to where we're at now. We don't get there without many of the other parts of it, ancient humanity. And then where that sits in the animal kingdom at large, and just life on Earth. So I think that's all really, really powerful, which kind of bleeds to my next part of this. Is I haven't talked about it too much on here. I do want to ask about sexual selection, just kind of briefly. I've talked to David on here, so he talked a little bit about that, and a few other people. But where do we fit convergent evolution? Because that's really, that's deeply fascinating, where we can see similar traits or similar features in multiple species. And,
Right.
and then when you put humans in the mix, that I have tried very hard in just personal conversations about with people, and even on here, we have to get away from this notion of humans are so distinct. We're so different from other animals. In some ways we are, but other animals are distinct and different, right? The creatures that live at, the bottom of the sea, and how they're, they illuminate, like that's, I can't do that. You can't do that. That's unique to them. Like, so just fitting us as another animal in the kingdom of sorts. But yeah, how do we understand, and what's the utility and purpose of understanding convergent and or divergent, but convergent evolution? Because that might help lead to the questions I have about evolutionary psychology. So, but yeah, how do we understand convergent evolution?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I guess part of what you're talking about is human exceptionalism, right? Like humans like to think we're so special, we're so better than all these other species, and we have all these amazing abilities. We do have amazing abilities that other species don't have. But like you said, other species have amazing abilities that we don't have. Ants will wander looking for food, and they'll have to wander far and wide. And when they come back, they take the shortest route, like a vector integration map that they're solving. Dolphin communication is amazing. You've got bats that, the way that bats navigate, echolocation is incredible. It's crazy. In order for a bat to echolocate, sound as it travels becomes weak quite quickly. So if you're going to send a sound wave and you're going to bounce it off of a tree and it's going to come back to you, it's going to be really weak by the time it gets back to you, too weak for you to use for navigation. So bats have to produce these incredibly loud noises, so that it's so loud that by the time it gets back to them, it's still loud enough for them to use. But if they produce a sound that is so very loud then they risk damaging their own ears when they produce that sound.
Yeah.
So they've evolved the ability to shut down their hearing when they produce the sound and then turn on their hearing again when the sound returns to them. But they're sending out dozens of pulses a second or hundreds of pulses a second, which means that in perfect synchrony, they're sending out sounds, turning off their ears, receiving sounds and turning on their ears dozens or hundreds of times a second. It's incredible.
Yeah. Beluga whales also use the echolocation underwater, which is
Right.
it's a whole other layer to it, right? Because bats are doing it above water, they're not, and there's a difference, right? Obviously we have oxygen, they're doing it in the air, but beluga whales do it in a different context, a completely different context. I mean, normalized for them, but it's still a different context.
Right. And so part of deflating human exceptionalism is appreciating all the incredible things that these other species can do that we can't. One example I like with rats is that because they often get sick from new foods, when they eat a new food, they only take a small nibble and then they wait to see if they get sick. And if a few hours later they get sick, they avoid that food in the future. And if they don't get sick, they know that they can eat it again. And if they never eat two new foods at once, because that's two novel variables. So if they got sick, they wouldn't be able to infer which food made them sick. So if they're ever eating multiple foods, one will be novel, but one will be familiar, so that then if they get sick, they can correctly infer it was the novel food that made them sick and avoid that food in the future. And what that is it's manipulating only one variable at a time. That's the scientific method, basically, right? Like they're only manipulating one variable at a time so that when the conclusion comes out, they can know which variable drove the outcome. I love that example, but it's just suggesting that I think partly to deflate this human exceptionalism, we need to appreciate that spiders and ants and rats can do incredible things that we cannot.
On the rat piece there, I'm just curious. It just popped into my head is, do they also have a discuss system, not analogous to humans in terms of how we have a discuss system, but do they have another space for in their brains and their bodies for disgust as part of a function for kind of selecting out the types of food so they don't get poisoned or they don't get or it's bad for them, or is that something different or something else going on?
I mean, they most probably do. There's kind of different ways to tackle that question. Rats do have what's called food neophobia, which is wariness around new foods for the reason that we just discussed, because it might end up making them sick. Now, often, if people say, like, are rats, do they experience disgust? Do horses experience disgust? It's obviously difficult to tap the subjective phenomenology of rats and horses, like what are they feeling? But if we're willing to go on neuro and on behavior, they exhibit something that looks very much like disgust in that they avoid the kinds of foods that would make them sick. And there's plenty of different species that deal with diseased conspecifics. Many species make sure to eliminate in a different place than they eat. Many species will quarantine diseased conspecifics and remove them from the nest so that they don't infect the others. There are species that will groom themselves and others with chemicals that they produce that are bacteria killing, so as to protect themselves and the partners that they groom from parasites. Now, again, it's hard to tap the subjective phenomenology of what's going on in these species, but what we do know is that they're behaving in a disease avoidance manner. They're quarantining conspecifics, they're removing dead conspecifics from the nest or from the colony. They are actively killing bacteria with their grooming habits. Birds will sometimes do what's known as anting, so they'll prostrate themselves before ants and let the ants climb on them and release formic acid on them to kill some of the ectoparasites that live on them. So, the word disgust is a little loaded because we often think of how we subjectively feel about it, but certainly quarantining conspecifics, avoiding disease, and dealing with disease by producing chemicals that are used for grooming to kill parasites, stuff like that, wide variety of species engage in that.
Yeah, no, that's deeply fascinating. And then on the convergent evolution piece, I think it's one of those interesting things where we can see, like, so for example, I remember when I was first getting into evolutionary science and really studying it and reading it, one of the things that was really convincing for me was, obviously the fossil record's convincing, and genetics now are really convincing. But for me, it was knowing that there are certain things that all mammals do, right? Or any other taxonomy, whichever taxonomy you want to use. But mammals is one of them. It's like what they, all or most mammals will birth in a similar way. They will, females will lactate to nourish their young. And it was like, oh yeah, we're not so exceptional. Like we do the exact same thing. And other species, I mean, they might have differences or how they do, but they're doing or they have the same parts or the same functionality. And I would say that's a piece of that, right? And then you can always look at it in terms of the skeletal structures of certain species. So like, there's a lot of time in between them and different, species in between them. But, birds and reptiles, alligators, crocodiles, I mean, they are connected. They might have 200 million years in between them, but there is some, and you can see it by their feet. And
right.
Very simple. So convergent evolution is all of these different ways in which we see pieces of, one species in another species and how they go. But is there anything else that you want to, say about that element or how that's important?
I do think that's important. I would say that sometimes when you see similarities between species, it's because of homology or shared descent as opposed to because of convergent evolution. But convergent evolution, which I think is a fascinating thing, is the notion of quite different species evolving similar solutions because they encountered similar ecological problems. So, I mean, we've already talked about echolocation. That might be a good example of bats, dolphins, whales, bats and cetaceans being pretty different, but evolving similar solutions to a similar environmental problem. Or organisms that are quite different, but that have evolved light producing abilities, or organisms that flight and vision, which have evolved independently numerous times. Those are good examples of convergent evolution. And I think that many evolutionary scientists, evolutionary psychologists in specific, find convergent evolution quite interesting because they tend to take an engineering approach to the mind and to say, the way that the mind is structured, it was driven by the ecological and environmental problems that we encountered during the evolution of our species. So one of the most common evolutionary psychological ways of thinking about a problem or thinking about an evolved psychological mechanism is thinking, does this evolved psychological mechanism have a good engineering fit to the problem in the environment that it's supposedly evolved to solve? And let's try to see whether the structure and the function of this mechanism really do exhibit precision and economy and reliability in fitting, in an engineering sense, the problem it's supposedly evolved to solve. And that kind of way of thinking fits with thinking about convergent evolution, because you're asking yourself, okay, whales and bats are quite different, but they both encountered a similar problem. Did they evolve a solution that fits that problem in an engineering sense quite well? And so convergent evolution is a nice tool for the psychologist engineer who likes thinking about, does this psychological mechanism appear to fit the problem that it supposedly evolved to solve?
Yeah, no, that's great. The thing that I wanted to jump into, so we'll kind of skip over sexual selection because I've talked about it before, but it's obviously very, very powerful and very important. And I think Darwin himself and many people now realize that it's probably more important. I don't want to say more important, but it has a lot of power, and even sometimes more so than natural selection. But I want to jump to kind of the way we think about it now, just kind of at a broad view, and then kind of some of the criticisms of kind of what I guess you could say the evolutionary sciences now. I had Nicole Barbero on here. We talked about this a little bit. I've had other people that have kind of mentioned this and alluded to this, but there seems to be over time certain fields or disciplines. So you obviously have biology, behavioral ecology, ethology, and then we have now evolutionary psychology. And sometimes, I mean, there's probably infighting with all of this stuff, but that there's this way of saying, okay, how do we put all of them in the same house instead of having their own separate houses, right? They're all talking about the same things. They're all in the same zip code, right? They're just on different streets, right? and how to, and more of a multidisciplinary kind of intersecting as opposed to just like all these different kind of houses and stuff. So how do we see the evolution of, like, you know, evolutionary psychology? Like why do psychologists give a shit about evolution? Why do they care? And why is there a subfield of this? Why does this matter? You know, kind of explain it in terms of, I know it kind of has origins with ethology. And so, but explain that a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So I do think ethology is crucial for evolutionary psychology in a couple of ways. I mean, in the historical development of the evolutionary sciences, ethology pushed two ideas which I think are absolutely foundational to evolutionary psychology. One of them is the distinction between the proximate and the ultimate levels of analysis, or Tinbergen's four questions. Nico Tinbergen famously argued that for any biological or behavioral phenomenon, if you want to get a comprehensive understanding or explanation of it, you have to answer four separate questions that fall on separate levels of analysis. Ontogeny or development, which means how did this thing evolve? How does this thing develop in the animal's lifespan? Mechanism or immediate causation, which is how does it work right now in the animal's body or brain or behavior? How does it work? What causes it right now mechanistically? Phylogeny, which is how did it evolve? And function, which is why did it evolve? What's the survival or reproductive function that it serves? And this argument that if you try to explain a behavior or a biological phenomenon, skipping some of these levels of analysis or skipping some of these questions, you have an incomplete and necessarily incomplete understanding of that phenomenon. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think that should be the foundation for psychology. And that's maybe a bold statement that some people won't agree with, but I really think that what this does is it helps us see, like, it gives you an epistemic map of the territory and tells you that you may be doing a great job answering one or two of these four questions, but if you're ignoring one or two or three, well, then your science is necessarily incomplete. Your explanation is necessarily incomplete. So I take that to be foundational for evolutionary psychology and for psychology and for any behavioral science. The other thing that ethology was very good at showing and arguing is that behaviors are the product of evolution too, not just anatomy and morphology. I mean, at that point, everybody knew that bones had evolved and everybody knew that aspects of our morphology had evolved. But the ethologists did a really good job of showing that behavior is a product of evolution too. And there's different arguments you can make for why that's somewhat obvious. One argument is that behavior is produced by the brain and by physical structures in the body. And so if the brain and physical structures in the body are the products of evolution, well, then it stands to reason that behavior is a product of evolution. It was also already known by then that artificial selection for behavioral traits works. So we already knew that you can use artificial selection in dogs or pigeons to produce variants that are more playful or less playful, or more aggressive or less aggressive, or better olfaction or worse olfaction. And those are psychological and behavioral traits. So what you're essentially doing is driving the evolution of psychological and behavioral traits, except it's you choosing to do it rather than it happening passively due to natural selection. But these and other pieces of arguments and evidence made it clear that, yes, behavior is a product of evolution too, not just anatomy and morphology. So these two key insights, that behavior is a product of evolution, and there are four questions that we must ask of any behavioral and biological phenomenon if we want to get a complete answer to it. These two things are foundational to evolutionary psychology, and I would argue foundational to all of psychology, even though we haven't necessarily gotten there yet. There's a lot of psychology that isn't very plugged into Tinbergen or to proximate ultimate or things like that. Evolutionary psychology sort of added a couple of pieces. One thing that evolutionary psychologists do that many other evolutionists don't do is focus a lot on information processing, on the psychological or information processing level of analysis. And evolutionary psychologists often make the claim that even though behavior is a product of evolution, and what we want to understand is behavior in many circumstances, if you want to explain and predict behavior, you're best off not going directly from the principles of evolution to behavior. You're best off going from the principles of evolution to the mind, the information processing mechanisms in the mind that produce behavior, and then going from those information processing mechanisms to behavior. And if you do that, if you don't skip the psychological level of analysis, then you will do better in your explanations and your predictions. So like one example might be, there's this very cool work done on incest aversion by Deborah Lieberman. And her work shows that when we are growing up, the human mind uses a couple of key cues to tag our siblings as siblings and then produce incest aversion at the thought of having sex with them. And two of the key cues that we appear to use are, one, childhood co-residence. So if you're growing up with this other kid in the same household, your brain takes that as a cue that this is probably a sibling or genetic relative of mine. And then the other one is maternal perinatal association, especially if you're the older kid watching your mother breastfeed a younger kid. It's a reasonable guess that that kid is your sibling or a close genetic relative of yours. And so the argument in the finding is that when we're growing up, the human brain uses these two key cues, the breastfeeding one and the childhood co-residence, to tag this other kid as probable sibling, and then to produce feelings of disgust at the thought of being sexually active with them. Now, the reason that this is so cool is because when the failures of this mechanism illuminate a lot. So there's a phenomenon called Taiwanese minor marriages, where a young boy used to be betrothed to a young girl. They used to be basically married to one another or betrothed to one another at age 3 or 4. And then the boy and the girl would grow up together in the boy's parents' home. So the boy and the girl would grow up together with the boy's family. And they were expected to eventually, when they hit puberty and then became reproductively mature, they were expected to love each other, to have sex with one another, to produce babies together, and to be a normal romantically pair bonded pair. But what happened instead was they didn't feel sexual attraction toward each other. They had higher divorce rates than usual. They had higher affair rates than usual, and they just were not sexually attracted to one another. And the reason why appears to be that even though they weren't siblings, they grew up in the same household, which tricked their brains into thinking that they were siblings because their brains received the key informational cue of childhood co-residence, of thinking, I've grown up with this person my whole life, so they're probably a sibling. And so that produced incest aversion at the thought of having sex with that person. The other way that this mechanism can fail is, imagine you have two siblings and they are separated at birth. Let's say they're brother and sister, and they're separated at birth, and they're reared in different households. And then they meet for the first time when they're fully grown adults. Well, they might now be sexually attracted to one another, and they might fall in love with one another because they grew up separately and they never met each other. Their brains didn't get the key informational input of childhood co-residence in order to tag each other as siblings. So even though they're genetic siblings, their brains never tagged each other as such. And so when they meet as adults, they may be attracted to one another. And this has happened many times, and they've been attracted, tried to get married, and so on. But the reason that I think these examples are cool is because it shows that if you tried to go directly from the principles of evolution to behavior, then this wouldn't make sense. You would say, well, why the hell are the siblings attracted to one another? Why are they trying to get married? Why are they trying to have sex? It just doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. But that's if you skip the information processing psychological level of analysis. If you don't skip it, it totally makes sense. It's like, oh, the reason that they're attracted to one another in adulthood is because when they were growing up, their minds didn't get the cues, the informational inputs needed to tag each other as siblings. And that's why their minds failed to produce incest aversion at the thought of having sex with each other. Similarly, with the Taiwanese minor marriages, you might be confused about why are they not attracted to each other? Why does this keep happening? Why do they have such high divorce rates? And if you're trying to explain that behavior by reference to evolution while skipping the psychological level of analysis, it's difficult to understand. But if you don't skip the psychological level of analysis, it becomes clear, oh, they grew up together, therefore their brains got this informational input of them having childhood co-residence, and therefore they tagged each other as siblings. So to me, that's an example of why one of the things that an evolutionary psychological perspective adds, that if you do not skip the information processing level of analysis, your predictions and your explanations become even more accurate.
So that's incredible. And this is something that I see come up a little bit is, well, science is just it's something, well, not all science, but some science is just descriptive. It's telling us about the world. It's telling us about things, but science doesn't tell me how to behave. It doesn't tell me how to act. And I can see maybe some of that argument, but I think it is, for the most part, I mean, I don't want to make an absolute statement on that, but I think that is flawed. That's a flawed way of thinking about things, because it's saying, of course it's going to. It's not only informational. It's not only descriptive, right? I'm not necessarily saying that it is prescriptive, but science can tell us, especially in behavioral literature and behavioral fields, that it can tell us how to behave or how to act in certain situations. And I think the example that you gave is probably one of those ways in which that occurs.
Right. Well, I might try to modify that slightly.
Okay.
I like to think of science as descriptive, predictive, and explanatory. Describes, it predicts, and it explains. And it doesn't prescribe or proscribe, in the sense that it doesn't tell us how to behave or how we ought to behave. It can help us figure out, given a goal that we already have. Like, let's say we agree we want to reduce sentient suffering. We want to reduce the suffering of any sentient creature. If we all agree on that goal already, then science can tell us how to behave to achieve that goal. But we have to still agree on that goal to begin with. We have to say, my goal is to have healthy children, or my goal is to prevent all sentient suffering, or something like that. And that goal really is it's a value goal, right? It's a philosophical value ought prescriptive goal. And if you have agreed on what that goal is, science is the best mechanism for helping you figure out how to reach that. But what science itself can't do is it can't supply those goals for you, or supply those values for you. But it's a superb way of reaching those goals and values if you figured out what they are or what you want them to be.
Yeah, no, that's sharper. Yeah, I like that. I guess the last piece on this, and then we'll transition to the other topic, is I mean, you probably are more privy to this than I am. I don't see a lot of it, but I do hear it every now and then where there will be a lot of criticisms about evolutionary psychology. And I don't know how, deep in the weeds you want to get with that, but, maybe you want to just kind of generally kind of give some statements about, why do people criticize it, and what are some, general answers refuting that? You can get as specific as you want, but whatever you make sense.
Sure. I'll throw out a few. There are some, I think that the criticisms vary in how cogent they are. The best criticisms I've ever heard come from evolutionary psychologists themselves. The weaknesses are. The most outlandish criticisms come from people who have not even read the material and are making remarks that is like, what on earth are you talking about? So one of them, which you'll never hear evolutionary psychologists doing this, but you'll hear critics often saying this. Critics will say that evolutionary psychologists use the science to justify bad behavior, and they'll claim that if something is evolved, therefore it's good. If something is natural, therefore it's good, or therefore it's justifiable. This would be the notion, for example, that if there's an evolutionary basis to aggression or warfare or infidelity, that makes it okay. But you'll never actually hear an evolutionary psychologist arguing this or espousing this view. You will very frequently hear detractors claiming that this is what evolutionary psychology is all about. So at the far end of the spectrum are these completely ungrounded notions, but I actually encounter them a lot. I encounter the notion that evolutionary psychologists say this about male sexuality because they want to justify male infidelity, when you actually listen to the researchers and nobody's saying that. You also have other arguments that are more reasonable, that are about just so stories, or do evolutionary psychologists think everything is an adaptation? That's one step more reasonable. But even these seem to be lacking. For example, the just so story one, the notion is that evolutionary hypotheses or evolutionary psychological hypotheses are just so stories. But this accusation or criticism trades on a misconception. The misconception being that in order to test them, you need to travel into the past, or you need to have perfect knowledge of the past. And frequently the thing that we talked about earlier, which is that really what you need to do is use your hypothesis to generate novel predictions that you test in the modern day. That seems to be missing from the criticism. There's another criticism, which is that evolutionary psychologists think that everything is an adaptation. as opposed to, for example, a byproduct, a side
Mm-hmm.
effect.
Mm-hmm.
Or just statistical noise that doesn't matter.
Right.
Now, I also think this criticism is misplaced, because if you read papers or chapters by evolutionary psychologists, they come right out and they say evolution leads to 3 products: adaptations, byproducts, and noise. And then they say, for example, if you look at bones, the whiteness of bones is not an adaptation. It didn't evolve to be white because whiteness solves some problem. It's just a byproduct of the calcium in the bones.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you, to give a psychological example, plenty of evolutionary psychologists argue that religion and religious belief is a byproduct of theory of mind mechanisms and agency detection systems, as opposed to an adaptation. It didn't evolve for the purpose of believing in religion, but rather it is a side effect of a number of other psychological mechanisms we have that lead us to see patterns quite easily and to see agency and so on. Many psychologists will argue that homicide, including various forms of homicide, spouse killing and infanticide and so on, are byproducts. Other evolutionary psychologists have argued that racism and categorization by race are byproducts, because given the way we evolved, humans would not have even encountered people of other races. And so categorizing people by race and the racism that sometimes results from that is a byproduct of mechanisms that evolved for categorizing coalitions, not based on race, but based on other cues. And then you've got a number of other, so whether you're looking at the theoretical papers or the empirical papers, you see lots of work coming out of evolutionary psychologists arguing that numerous things are byproducts, not adaptations, and writing chapters that analyzes what byproducts are, what adaptations are, and what noise is, and how to differentiate them from one another, and offering examples of all of the above, and so on and so forth. But for some reason, this criticism it has a lot of staying power, even if it doesn't actually connect with the literature.
Yeah.
I keep seeing it again and again. And I have actually a long list, which I can share with you if you'd like. I have a list of different papers and chapters in which evolutionary psychologists keep saying not everything is an adaptation. Here's some other byproducts, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But for some reason, people can't get over this particular criticism. So these are the criticisms that I think are weak and fall flat. I think there are criticisms that are legitimate that I often hear from evolutionary psychologists. One of them is that we should do more cross-cultural research. One of the, including in non-weird populations. One of them is that we should attend even more to the information processing level of analysis, because even as evolutionary psychologists, we sometimes treat the mind as a bit of a black box and make predictions about behavior without paying sufficient attention to what's the computational structure of these neurocognitive mechanisms? What cues do they use? How do they process these cues? How do they treat these cues hierarchically? At this point, we're kind of getting into the weeds, which may or may not be necessary. But I guess I mention it because I think that there are some actually helpful constructive criticisms, like greater attention to computation and information processing, greater attention to cross-cultural studies, that are actually useful suggestions. Typically, though, and sadly, what you often hear from the non-evolutionary crowd is not the real helpful criticisms, but rather the ones that are based on misconceptions and that fall flat. I don't know if at this point I've forgotten.
No, that's great. I just have one follow-up on that. I guess just a final piece on this is one question may be, well, why do we need a whole subcategory of psychology, evolutionary psychology?
That's a great question.
Can't clinical psychologists do this? And, other types of behaviorists can do this or have been doing this. What's the point or the purpose or functionality of a whole other subgenre, if you will, of psychology, evolutionary psychology doing? Do we need folks like that, or can we blend it in with something else? Or, and I think sometimes people will have that question of, well, what's the point? Why do we need evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me try to answer it in two different ways.
Please.
One way is to say that I think that eventually the goal is to no longer have evolutionary psychology. It's just to get to a point where in the future, Psychology is like biology in the sense that anybody who's studying animal behavior is asking 4 questions. They're asking phylogeny, function, ontogeny, and mechanism. So if you look at why a beaver builds dams or how a beaver builds dams, you implicitly and automatically know that there are 4 different questions you're interested in. How did dam building evolve over time? Why did it evolve? How does it work right now? And how does it develop from the beaver's infancy until now? And every person studying animal behavior or comparative cognition or animal cognition knows that implicitly. And I think the goal is eventually to get to a psychology where the word evolutionary can be dropped. It becomes implicitly assumed that if you want to study human anger or human lying or human sex or human music production or whatever, you want to try to tackle all 4 questions. And so ultimately the goal is to no longer need this word and for all of psychology to be asking all 4 of Tinbergen's questions. That's one way of kind of answering this question. The other way of answering this question is that at present, we're nowhere near there, right? At present, we're at the point where the vast majority of psychology is entirely proximate. It deals with just mechanism and development. So cognitive psychology is proximate, social psych, personality psych, clinical psych, neuroscience, biopsych, psychophysiology. All of psychology is just proximate, entirely neglects phylogeny and entirely neglects function. And in fact, most psychologists also neglect development, except for developmental psychologists. So right now, this is needed, even if the ultimate goal is to get to a point where it can be shed and where that word is no longer needed. In relation to that, I would add one other thing, which is that evolutionary psychology is not really a branch of psychology in the sense that it's not tackling a particular content area. There's a sense in which social psych is a branch because it focuses on the content area of social relationships. And personality, you might say it's a branch because it focuses on the structure of personality and on individual differences and so on. But evolutionary psych, rather than having a content area that it is focused on, is instead a lens or a theoretical perspective through which to look at all of psychology, such that you can do evolutionary social psych, evolutionary personality psych, evolutionary developmental psych, evolutionary clinical psych, evolutionary neuroscience, etc. It's basically just bringing an evolutionary biological perspective to questions ranging from social behavior to individual differences to pathology to development to cognition and memory and whatever. And so, I mean, maybe that's like, not that important, but I would regard it as a lens or a theoretical framework rather than a branch. And then I would say that eventually, if psychology gets thoroughly infused with Tinbergen's 4 questions, or at least the proximate ultimate distinction, if we get to that point, we will no longer need the word evolutionary before, because everybody will know we want to tackle all 4 of Tinbergen's 4 questions.
Yeah, it sounds like it's more headed towards an integration within the field itself. So that way it's not necessary to be kind of separate. So I think that's super important. And I really appreciate the way you explain that. Okay, so we're going to leave evolution behind, and we've got a good framework for that. And that was absolutely fantastic. So I'm really happy with how you explained everything. So that was great. Now, a little bit different, but within psychology proper, I guess you could say, is you wrote a very nice piece at Arrow. One plug for Arrow. Arrow is a great publication. Everyone should subscribe and follow and all the rest. It's great. On the Myers Briggs, and the piece is called "Should You Trust the Myers Briggs Personality Test?" So I'm gonna read the intro because it immediately grabbed me. And so this is your piece here. The Myers Briggs Type Indicator is the most popular personality test in the world. It's a favorite among Fortune 100 companies, government agencies, and regular people. More than 1.5 million people take it every year. It is a thriving multi-million-dollar a year industry. And as any psychologist worth their salt will tell you, it's mostly bullshit. Love it. Absolutely love it. I'll just say real quick before we get into it. I'm sure this happens to you. This happens to me. I'll have friends and family, and people will come up to me and be like, oh yeah, what are your, have you done the Myers Briggs? You must know, you do psychology, you must know about this. And what are your letters? And, I'm an ENFTJ or whatever. And I don't really get into it with people because, it's harmless. People don't know. But when people really like start telling me like really serious things about personality and other people, like, before I start dating, I ask these people what their letters are before I go on a date. And I will say, okay, I would probably put as much weight in Myers-Briggs as I would my horoscope sign. They're like, what? Are you serious? Like, it's so accurate, blah, 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 blah. And of course you have, what's the other popular one? Enneagram. That's the other one. Yeah, there's another similar one. There's all these kind of popularized ones. So I guess just before we get into the piece, why did you want to write it? Were you just tired of answering these questions as well?
I wrote it for a similar reason to the one that you're just describing, is that I come across people in my normal life and social life who believe in it and thinks it describes them to a T. Yeah. And we can talk about why people think it describes them so well, even though it doesn't. But I also come across in my classes really smart students who are doing great in so many different ways in psychology as undergraduate majors. And they're doing great in my personality psychology class, and yet they still cling to this belief in the Myers-Briggs. And I guess I also saw some other intelligent friends of mine on Facebook or somewhere else talking about it and believing in it and giving it a lot of credence. And it just struck me that, I mean, as you mentioned, people use it for dating. People also use it for hiring purposes and promotion purposes and stuff. So it's used in the dating world, in the business and industrial and organizational world. And then very smart people I know believe in it despite the fact that it's bullshit. And all of these things made me think, okay, maybe we need another, even though there are already articles out there.
Yeah.
But I thought maybe it's time for yet another one explaining why.
It was great. I mean, the way you organized it was really, able to kind of grab people, and it was nice. So you give at least, 7 or so reasons or 8 reasons of why it's, pretty not helpful, not accurate. But maybe let's just say what it is, and then what its kind of function is, how it works, and then we can get into why it's maybe not so good.
Yeah, so it's a personality test that claims to figure out which of 16 different personality types you fall into, and you were mentioning the numbers ENTPJ and so on. So you're either extroverted or you're introverted. You're either sensing or you're intuiting. All of these they set up these different dichotomies. You're either this or that. You're either this or that. And then when you mix and match, you end up being one of the 16 different possible personality types. And then if once you've gotten your type, this is supposed to explain things like what kind of career you're best suited for, what kind of life you're best suited for, perhaps what kind of romantic partner you're best suited for, etc. And that's the basics, I guess.
How many items is it? It's been a while since I've taken one.
Well, there's different versions, and so I haven't memorized the item number, but there's not only the real Myers-Briggs, and then there's a bunch of different knockoffs and variants and tweaks, but exact number of items, I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a 500 item, but I can't remember. I can't remember how many it is, but it's not too laborious. And usually on the item analysis, it's usually, what's an example of a question? I mean, most people have taken it, but I can't think of an example of a question that's asked. They're just basic like interests and what you like, and like, do you like, certain types of magazines? Do you find that you do this as opposed to this? Like trying to get at the different types, the extroversion, introversion, sensing, all those things. And so each question will then, this is kind of on the test construction, but each item will kind of be plugging in, if you will, to one of these letters or one of the 16 types or whatever.
Right. We'll be helping to shunt you toward this category or that category. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess for reason number 1 that you start with is it's based on Carl Jung's ideas. Now, I mean, what do you have against Carl Jung, man? I mean, what did he do to you, man? Carl Jung's a good guy. He was, trying to find his way in psychology post Freud. I mean, what's wrong with Carl Jung?
I mean, no, that's fair. And I try to make clear in the essay that is, and I straight up say, like, this is the least important reason of the 8.
Yeah.
And we should not base our rejection of the Myers-Briggs on this because, conceivably, I mean, a lot of his ideas were not very well empirically substantiated. That was not just his fault. Psychology at that time did not run rigorous tests. I want to say did not run rigorous tests like today, but we might debate whether or not running rigorous tests today. But at the very least, psychology was not running rigorous tests back then.
Right.
And so that's definitely not a problem that was unique to Jung. But his ideas, first of all, some of them are kind of on the edge of religion, alchemy, and less mysticism, and are less sort of scientific. But then also they didn't necessarily get tested because he was coming up with these interesting ideas and he was writing about them, but he wasn't running empirical studies on them to verify them or refute his hypotheses. So you basically have a situation where there's a collection of claims and ideas which might be correct, but might be incorrect, and also are a little bit off in terms of some of the mystical / religious elements. But then, most importantly, they don't get tested, so you don't get to keep the good ones and discard the bad ones on the basis of the results of empirical studies. And then after that, 2 people who were non-psychologists and non-psychometricians and non-experts in test construction built a test based on his untested, unsupported ideas. And that was how the Myers-Briggs was born. Now, in the essay, I mentioned that, look, even this isn't enough to reject the test because it is possible to have untested, unsupported ideas. And then it's possible to have non-experts create a test based on those untested ideas. And it's possible for that test to come out accurate and good and reliable and valid and useful. So that's the weakest reason of all for us to reject the Myers-Briggs. But it is a kind of like a mini red flag, like let's watch out as we go forward, because both its basis and its construction were both non-vetted. So it's like let's be cautious. And then we move into the real objections. And the real objections have to do with modern psychology, psychometrics, and test construction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, in the piece you're very charitable towards it, which is nice. I mean, you're not just slamming Jung, but I will say, I'll say personally that I think the kind of the lesson here from this piece is everything you just said is right. I mean, we absolutely need theory. We need ways of conceptualizing. We need theoretical understandings of things. We need that. It's not just pure scientific method. That's super important, but it's a both and, it's not an either or. And most clinical therapies have theory, research, practice, technique, etc. Right? So that in itself isn't bad, right? And I totally agree with you on that. I think one of the lessons that we can pull out from here is, now I'll personally, you're not saying this, I'm saying this. I think that a lot of the times with self-help and positive psychology, it tends to be bullshit. I mean, it really has these, kind of spurious claims, and it beats a lot of woo-woo science. And I put Carl Jung kind of in there. Now, that's not his fault necessarily, right? You've got to start with a theory. And again, at the time, stats and measurement and personality was very early goings, if at all. You got to have a starting place. But I think we need to have a mixture of both, and we need to have them, validate them. And if they don't, we need to maybe not discard it, but be more cautious about it. And I feel the same thing happens today. Right. People get very excited about some really positive ideas or something they really like. And, they read a self-help book or they saw a TED talk or whatever. And the idea might be okay, but we have to test it. We have to get reliable support. Otherwise, it's just charlatans selling snake oil, and that's not a new thing. And I don't think Carl Jung was doing that. Some of his mythology stuff's kind of cool, but it doesn't necessarily. Some of it doesn't. And so the Myers-Briggs, the theoretical underpinnings for the Myers-Briggs, which he came up with, don't. I think yes, you're right. Is the kind of cautiousness, this kind of red flag. So
not outright rejection, but cautiousness. And I think that, you're right that we need theory and we need evidence. The relationship between them is supposed to be reciprocal, right? Like you follow the theory and then you go test certain aspects of it. certain hypotheses that were derived from it. And then based on your findings, you're supposed to revise the theory if need be, modify the theory if need be. The problem is that, and again, not unique to Jung, not entirely his fault. Psychology was not as developed in those days, neither was psychometrics, etc. Yeah. But if you don't test them, you never get an opportunity to revise the theory. You never get an opportunity to keep the good parts and discard the bad parts. So you don't even get a chance to begin the process. So that is a potential danger. The other thing about theory is that theory can be very, very helpful, or it can be detrimental. Yeah. Because if you've got a very accurate theory, it can tell you where to look. It can help you pose good questions. It can give you a pretty good shot at having a good hunch or a good hypothesis about what is likely to be the case. If you have a bad theory or an inaccurate theory, it's going to send you down blind alleyways. It's going to waste your time. It's going to make you pose ill-posed questions. So, I mean, as an evolutionary psychologist, I think theory is actually incredibly important. Yeah. But you want to be grounded in a theory that is probably correct or probably close to correct or something like that. Right. And it can have advantages or disadvantages depending on what kind of theory you start with.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. So before we get into like kind of the other reasons for why the Myers Briggs isn't so good, is maybe just give us a very brief explanation of statistical reliability and validity, because this is really when people ask me, I'll say, Myers Briggs. I've said that to people as well. It's just it's a trash test. It's bullshit. Why is it bullshit? And I'll say, well, the primary reason for me is that it doesn't have any, or it has very minimal and not enough to really to give any strength to it, in my opinion, of any statistical reliability or validity, which means then when I talk to people, I have to explain to them statistical reliability and validity. So maybe you can kind of just explain both of those concepts, and then that will get into the reasons why it doesn't function well.
Yeah, sure. So there's different types of validity and different types of reliability, but I think for our purposes, the most important would be, for reliability, we'll focus on what's called retest reliability, which basically means if I give you the test now, and then if I give it to you again in 3 weeks, and this is a personality test, it should reveal roughly the same answer as now and 3 weeks from now. There can be a little bit of fluctuation because everybody's mood goes up and down, and everybody is a little bit more energetic or more anxious on one day or another day. Totally normal. But your personality fundamentally is not wildly different between now and 3 weeks from now. So if I give you this test now and 3 weeks from now, it should give me roughly the same results. And that consistency from time 1 to time 2 is reliability. Test reliability. So that's the type of reliability that we'll care about most for now. And then validity is really, does this test accurately measure what it purports to measure? Does it accurately measure what it claims to measure? Right. And the type of validity that I think maybe we'll care most about in this conversation is predictive validity, which is specifically, does this test actually help us predict stuff that we might care about in real life? Like, does it help us predict who will perform well in this job or that job? Who will perform poorly in this job or that job? Who will go well with a romantic partner of this type or that type? Like, who will be compatible with a romantic partner of this type or that type? Or other outcomes we might care about are who's liable to get heart disease, who's liable to get imprisoned, who's more likely to fall into drug use, et cetera, and so forth. These are life outcomes that we might care about. And we might want to construct a personality test that has some predictive validity, that has some predictive success at predicting these job or romantic or drug or life outcomes. And so, yeah, when we talk about it, I guess we'll probably focus on predictive validity and retest reliability.
Right. And so for the predictive validity piece of it is, well, there's no point of taking a test if it doesn't have decent or moderate predictive validity, because then why the hell are you taking it? It's not going to tell you anything, right? If I want to know what my outcomes are, or my potential outcomes for, career or romantic relationships or anything else, why am I going to, if the test sucks at that, then why am I going to listen to that? Because it's not going to be an accurate representation of what could potentially be an outcome for me. So I'll just use another test. Right. So the Myers Briggs doesn't have good predictive validity, and maybe say a little bit more about why it doesn't, and then maybe we can say other tests that do.
Yeah. So yes, it doesn't have very good predictive validity. It's not very good at predicting whether people will fit a certain career or do well in a certain career or do well with a certain romantic partner. And this might sound surprising to some listeners, but there are other tests that not only predict that stuff, but that even predict how likely you are to die early, how likely you are to get imprisoned, how likely you are to have a drug addiction. Now, it is important for listeners to know that when you and I say predict it, we don't mean predict it with 100% accuracy. We don't mean that you are determined to definitely become a drug addict or to fit with this romantic partner.
Right.
It's all probabilities and it's partial prediction. But there are tests that partially successfully predict everything from prison likelihood to drug likelihood to career in this way or in that way, career advancement, etc. And the Myers Briggs is not one of those that partially successfully predicts these outcomes. And then you said, why doesn't it? I think a very big reason of why it doesn't is because, and I think we'll probably end up talking about this more, personality in reality lies on a continuum or a spectrum. And the Myers Briggs forcibly dichotomizes personality. It forcibly shoves you into either this category or that category, either extroverted or introverted. And this is one of the reasons why the Myers Briggs loses predictive validity. Another reason that it loses predictive validity that we might talk about later is that it totally ignores the personality trait of neuroticism, which is extremely relevant. It's a very important personality trait, and it predicts everything from physical health problems to psychological health problems to addiction problems to likelihood of divorce to likelihood of relationship satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And if a test ignores it completely, which the Myers Briggs does, it's losing out on a huge source of predictive ability or predictive success, just missing out on that entirely.
Yeah. So in the piece, you talk about how variables in general, when we're doing different statistical analyses, we'll look at variables as being continuous or discrete. Namely, continuous, are they falling on, if listeners can picture a type of continuum, right? You have one endpoint in one direction, another endpoint in another direction, and everywhere in between on the line, that would be more continuous of sorts. And so discrete is it's either this bucket or this bucket, right? And there's no space in between. And so kind of what you're saying in that way is that for the Myers Briggs, it just puts people into this bucket or this bucket, right? More discrete and less continuous. And we know from tons of research and other types of measures that human personality is terribly complex, so many variables, so many interactions, and they're all over the place. They're all over across the spectrum or a continuum. And so less likely to be discrete. And so if the test itself is looking at this or this, either or, and you're trying to measure human personality that is the opposite of that, well, then it's not going to be very good at predicting outcomes for yourself or relationships, et cetera. Is that about right? Yeah,
that's exactly right. I mean, the ironic thing is that the test and the makers of the test are aware, I think, that human personality is continuous because they actually measure it continuously. But then after having gotten a score on a spectrum or continuum, then they say, if you fall like to the right of this arbitrary threshold that we've devised, then you're introverted. If you fall to the left of this arbitrary threshold that we've devised, then you're extroverted. And so it's like there's sort of an awareness, I think, that human personality is continuous because they measure it in a somewhat continuous fashion, but then they sort you into categories.
And that's almost worse though, right? I mean, in my view, because it's like, yeah. We're going to accept that, but we're still going to put you in a bucket, or we're still going to put you in one area or not. And that's so antithetical, I think, too. I mean,
yeah, I mean, it definitely drives down your predictive ability. It also drives down your reliability. So we talked briefly about test-retest reliability and how a personality test measured now and 3 weeks from now should give you roughly the same results. Well, the Myers-Briggs is notoriously bad at giving you roughly the same results. It's notoriously bad at being reliable. It ends up there was one study, for example, that found that within a period of about 5 weeks, it sorted 50% of the people who took it into a totally different category 5 weeks later. So even within only 5 weeks, that's just a bit more than a month, it will shift you into a different category. And actually the reason for that is also because if you have people falling on a continuum from, let's say, very, very introverted to very, very extroverted, if you then decide to split this continuum into two categories, it's going to give you a ton of problems, because somebody who was just on the boundary, who ended up in the extroverted category but barely, they might end up 3 weeks later being just on the other side of the boundary and being classified the opposite way. And it is the act of taking a continuum and forcibly breaking it into two categories that contributes to this really poor reliability. Tests that don't do that, that just measure it as a continuum, report it as a continuum, and keep going that way, they have much better reliability over weeks or months and even over years.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned in the piece, and it is one of the, it's an A theoretical. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but let's just, one of the strongest, I would say, or most popular, well, I don't want to say most popular, but it's a very strong A theoretical personality measure is the Big Five, right? So namely the Big Five is openness to experience, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, introversion, and I always forget the fifth one. Neuroticism. Right. And so, and there's sub categories under each of those, but so that's because you were highlighting about extroversion, introversion isn't even on the Myers Briggs, which is super important. So maybe talk about not as a comparison with the Myers Briggs, but how the Big Five is an example of a personality test that does have good predictive validity, good test retest reliability, and other statistical forms of power.
Sure. Yeah. I think you just said extroversion, introversion is missing from the Myers Briggs, but you meant neuroticism is missing.
Neuroticism. Excuse me. Yes. Excuse me.
Yeah. So the Big Five, as you said, it's openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. And each of those is a continuum ranging from very, very low to very, very high. So each one is a spectrum, a continuum. And the notion is that every person is located somewhere on each continuum. So if you wanted to get my personality profile, you'd need to find out where I fall on the openness to experience continuum, where openness to experience describes how open and interested somebody is in new cultures and new cuisines and new foods and new ideas and stuff like that. And you'd need to find out where I fall on the conscientiousness spectrum. And conscientiousness is about how responsible and diligent and hardworking and punctual and professional and so on and ambitious you are. And you also need to figure out where I fall on the extroversion continuum, where I fall on the agreeableness continuum, and where I fall on the neuroticism continuum. And if you are able to get my score on each of these five continua, then you have a reasonable, it's incomplete, but a reasonably good profile of my personality. And this kind of approach, the Big Five approach, turns out to predict, even if you measure it in children, it predicts life outcomes 30 years later. It predicts stuff like how likely they are to get promoted, how high their salary is likely to be, how likely they are to have trouble with their romantic relationships or less trouble, how likely they are to have physical health problems, and so on and so forth. And I'll just repeat one more time for the listeners is that, of course, it's not like conscientiousness alone perfectly predicts likelihood of having heart trouble or agreeableness perfectly predicts whatever, but offers some predictive success decades later at these important life outcomes. And the contrast is that the Myers Briggs, which dichotomizes all of these continua and forces you into this category or the other category, and which also ignores neuroticism, does not have this years later predictive power, this decades later predictive power.
Yeah, a few things about the Big Five that I'll say is it's very good, but you will have some changes if you take it again, which is kind of what we were talking about before. Test retest reliability does not mean it's going to be the exact same score every single time. So if I take the Big Five 10 years from now, it's going to be in the ballpark. It's going to be, you have different life experiences, you have different things that happen to you, you have just, growth, maturity, but it's going to be in the same universe. It's not going to be wild. I'm not going to be 80% openness to experience, and then I'm going to be at 20%, 10 years later. That would be very strange. So it's very much ballpark, which the Myers-Briggs cannot do. I could take the Myers-Briggs tomorrow. I could take it 10 years from now. I'm just going to get completely different scores because, again, it's not looking at, it's not as accurate on the modeling. The other thing about it is many times people, when I've given the Big Five and administer it and, you know, do feedback session and stuff, people they will automatically do, and this is what I think, I mean, you think you talk about it in the piece as well, is the Myers-Briggs gives people 4 letters and it gives you a box to put yourself in. And we like that because it makes sense. We don't like this kind of variance, the gray. But the Big Five, what it will say, the first thing many people will do is say, oh, I'm, you know, very high or very moderate, or 80% on neuroticism. That's a bad thing. That's a bad trait, right? And they put a value judgment or some type of attribution. Or I'm only 20% openness to experience. Oh my goodness, you know, and they will immediately make the attribution. And it's not to say that the traits are neutral per se, but that's a very inaccurate way, I think, of looking at the Big Five. It's not a positive, negative. You know, we do think about things in terms of valence, right? And so maybe you could think of it some way in that way, but it's more of, no, these things are. And how do you, again, it's a type of personality, and how can you, you know, be mindful and adjust and et cetera, but it's not necessarily giving value judgments on these things.
Right. Yeah, definitely not. I mean, I think we tend to bring those value judgments to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to think, I mean, most humans think of neuroticism as a bad thing. And then most humans think of agreeableness as a good thing, extroversion as a good thing, openness as a good thing, and conscientiousness as a good thing. But first of all, those are the value judgments that we bring to the table. We need to necessarily conceptualize it that way. One way I like to think about it is the way Daniel Nettle thinks about it. He's got this book, Personality, Why You Are the Way You Are, and papers on the subject as well. And one thing he does a very good job of pointing out is that each and every personality continuum has its upsides and its downsides. That is to say that if you're highly agreeable, that has upsides and downsides. The upsides are that you're nice to people, you're altruistic, they probably like you back. But the downside is that they may use you, exploit you, and trot all over you because you're so agreeable that you don't know how to say no, or they think that they can exploit you. If you're neurotic, the bad thing about that is that it'll probably give you or be related to psychological problems and health problems and marital problems and so on. But the good thing is that you are alert to danger. You are aware of the possible dangers in your environment. So you're probably going to be less likely to get mugged. You're probably going to be more likely of the potential threat coming your way and therefore avoid it. You'll be more likely to worry about whether or not you locked your house. So you'll double check. So you'll find that you hadn't locked it, and then you'll lock it. And so you'll be less likely to get robbed. And so the point that he makes is that, you know, the high end of any given continuum or the low end of any given continuum has both pros and cons. Right. Just to take one more example, conscientiousness, people think that being highly conscientious is great because indeed it predicts better grades, better salary, and more career promotions. But if you're super, super conscientious, people might regard you as stuffy and boring. You might not know how to live in the moment. You might not know
terribly rigid.
Terribly rigid. You might not be a lot of fun at parties. You might be the moralizer who's always telling people what to do. You might be that person who's always putting a coaster onto other people's kids. Right. And in fact, like even something like conscientiousness, at the extreme end, it can shade into OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Yeah. And that can be very defeating or detrimental in one's life. So Daniel Nettle does this really good job of highlighting, I think, the pros and cons of anywhere you fall on any of these continua. But I think you're right that most people tend to regard some of these things as good and some of these things as bad. And most people tend to regard neuroticism as bad. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be one of the reasons why neuroticism is missing from the Myers-Briggs, is because if most people think of it as bad, and if it predicts higher likelihood of divorce, higher likelihood of dissatisfaction in the relationship, higher likelihood of all of these things, losing your job, et cetera, then, and physical and health problems, well then, you don't really want to tell your customers, your paying customers, hey, you're really high on neuroticism. Look at all the bad shit that you have awaiting you. It's not a friendly message to give to people.
No, it's not.
Especially if you're trying to keep these clients and keep making money off of them and turn them away. I should probably say that, like, this is me speculating. I don't know for a fact why the Myers-Briggs doesn't include neuroticism, but this is a possibility. And The thing is, though, what that does, ignoring neuroticism, what that does is it drives down the reliability and the validity of the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, kind of talk about, there's one of the other reasons that are what makes the Myers-Briggs so poor is that it has these arbitrary boundaries. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. And you kind of talk about how it uses the median split and all that. So just kind of explain to us how it uses these arbitrary boundaries and why that's important.
Yeah, sure. So I use height as an analogy for this. Like if you measure people's heights and you find that they range, let's say you're measuring a couple hundred people and you find that they range from 4'11" to 6'2", you have this whole spectrum now running from 4'11" to 6'2". Now, if you decide that you're going to cut this up into 3 categories called short, medium, and tall, you now have to decide what are the boundaries of those categories? What is the cutoff between tall and medium? What is the cutoff between medium and short? And the problem is that no matter how you decide this, it's going to be arbitrary. You're going to have to pull it out of thin air. There is no, in reality, in the external world, there is no short, tall, and medium. There's just the continuum ranging from 4'11" to 6'2", or whatever you measure. But now you need to decide that 5'5" is the cutoff. And if you're 5'6", you're medium, but if you're 5'4", you're short. But that's an arbitrary decision. Or you need to decide 5'10" is the cutoff between medium and tall, so that if you're 5'10" or above, you're tall, but if you're below that, you're medium. But when you make this decision, you have to make it on the basis of something totally arbitrary. Right. And the way that the Myers-Briggs does it is they'll measure something like, for example, introversion, extroversion, and they'll get a nice wide range. And then they'll use the median. And the median is the middle number in a list of numbers. So let's say we have 50 people's scores, and they're going from really low extroversion to really, really high extroversion. We'll list all of those 50 scores going from the lowest to the highest. And then we'll find the middle, literally the middle score in that list. And that's the median. And we'll say, anybody above this is extroverted and anybody below this is introverted. But the problem is that decision to use the median is itself arbitrary. You could have used the average instead of median. You could have done it based on intuition or majority vote. But whatever method you use, it's going to be arbitrary. And it's not going to correspond to a real distinction in nature. It's a distinction that you've imposed on your data. And essentially, no matter where you come up with your arbitrary threshold, your arbitrary boundary, you have a problem. And your problem is that you're taking something that is actually a continuum, and you're saying, I need to forcibly shove this into categories. And in order to do so, I'm going to come up with a bullshit boundary, and I'm going to place that bullshit boundary here. And wherever you place it, it's not going to correspond to anything in real life. So that gives you multiple different downstream problems. One downstream problem that gives you is that you end up considering everybody below the median is introverted, everybody above the median is extroverted. But that means that somebody who fell just below the median is going to be counted as introverted, and somebody who fell just above the median is going to be counted as extroverted. They're counted as different categories, even though they're incredibly similar because they're both borderline, and they're maybe only a couple points away from each other, but you're counting them as different categories. Not only that, but the test is now considering this borderline introvert as more or less the same as an extreme introvert, and is considering this borderline extrovert as more or less the same as an extreme extrovert, when in reality, the borderline introvert and extrovert are more similar to one another. And the borderline in each category is quite different from the extreme scorer in his or her category. And so the test is actually getting it perfectly backward. It's telling you that the extreme and the borderline in a category are pretty similar, and the borderline in one category is pretty fundamentally different from the borderline in another category. And those two claims are both exactly backward. It's exactly wrong. It's more like the two borderlines are quite similar, and they are both quite different from the extremes in their own category. So that's like one of the several problems that arises when you come up with an arbitrary boundary and try to shove people on either side of the arbitrary boundary. Another problem is the one that we talked about with low test-retest reliability.
Right.
Because more people on a spectrum from extreme introversion to extreme extroversion, more people cluster around the middle than cluster at the extremes.
Right.
So those people who cluster around the middle are precisely those people who next week, if they're a bit happier or a bit more anxious, or the sun is shining a bit more, they're the people who are likely to tip over into the other side. But because so many of them are clustering around the middle, you have a lot of people who are likely to shift a few weeks later. And you only have a few people who are at the extremes who are unlikely to change if they take the test a few weeks later. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, right? It's the personality is not shifting this much, in such drastic ways so quickly. And kind of with the point you said about arbitrary boundaries, it reminds me of this shift that was made diagnostically for intellectual disability. So in the DSM-4 and 4TR, it was an axel system, so more categorical approach, which all that means is that you would have these cutoffs, right? So intellectual disability for the longest time used to be called mental retardation. That was the clinical term for it. And folks that had an IQ score of below 70, so 69 and below, would be mentally retarded. 70 and up, or 70 to, 70 to 79, I think, was borderline. And then 80 to 100 or whatever, 80 to 90, whatever, I can't remember. It was the below average in terms of intelligence. And over time, as they made the change in the DSM-5 and other things based on research, it was showing that, well, wait a minute, if, this has some really drastic real world implications. I'll give one example of that. So for people were trying to understand, so aside from the name change, so intellectual disability was the name change, appropriately so, it was like, well, it's not just intelligence, it's the adaptive qualities. And so it's like, well, it's not, 70 and a 69, there's no difference, right? If you're at a 70 IQ, that looks absolutely nothing than someone that has a 69 IQ. It's just the same thing. I mean, that's putting too much on like scoring error, right? And for some intelligence tests, when you're scoring it, it's like, is that a 1-point answer? Is that a 2-point answer? And that could really make the difference. I mean, those are all scores, but, over time you could be like, those could be some differences. And so that has real world implications for someone that's, let's say, on death row. Mm-hmm. And if someone has an IQ of 69, the person that assessed them gave them a score of 69, they're not getting the death penalty in certain states. But if you give them an IQ score of 70, they're getting the chair. I mean, that's one extreme example, extreme forensic example. So people took out this whole, it's like, well, what are we really getting at, right? This is an arbitrary boundary that we've had. What we're really looking for is some aspect of intellectual or cognitive capacity along with adaptive functioning. So let's look at it in terms of a range. And so now I think there's anywhere IQ scores of, 68 all the way up to 72, 73, and it is in tandem with all of the other components. So that's another example of a change in other areas of psychology of, well, yeah, the arbitrary boundaries probably don't work so well. And as the DSM-5, whether you hate it or love it, they did move to a more, multidimensional continuum kind of approach, because we're understanding that these things don't just happen of you have this and then you don't. There's variance of all these things. And this is the same in terms of Myers Briggs as well, in terms of the principle I'm trying to pull out.
Yeah. No, see, that's a great example. And it makes me think of the fact that really we use arbitrary boundaries in a wide range of circumstances. When we say that you're allowed to drink alcohol at 21, but not at 20 right. And 1 day less than 21.
In the United States.
In the United States. Where I grew up, it was 18 was the age. But whether 18 is the cutoff or 21 is the cutoff, it's totally arbitrary. And then 1 day before 21, you're not allowed, or 1 day before 18, you're not allowed, and then you are at 18. Or the age at which you can vote or the age at which you can drive. These are arbitrary boundaries. Now, we might argue that these arbitrary boundaries are necessary because if you're going to have a country and there's going to be laws regulating who can drive and who can drink, there's going to have to be some kind of arbitrary boundary. There's going to probably need to be some kind of boundary. And the boundary is almost surely going to be arbitrary. Now, The question becomes, does this arbitrary boundary have more costs than it does benefits, or more benefits than it does costs? One could arguably say that for a nation that you have to run with lots of millions of people, it's more beneficial to have that arbitrary boundary than not to have it and to have chaos. But when it comes to personality, it's not at all clear that the benefits you get from this arbitrary boundary outweigh the costs. In fact, in personality, it looks like you have tons of costs coming from this arbitrary boundary and very few benefits. We might even argue that for clinical psych, there's some benefits, because if you're going to diagnose somebody as having a disorder and you want them to have a certain symptom threshold, above that threshold, they have the disorder, below it, they don't. We can recognize that that too is an arbitrary boundary, and somebody who's just a shade above or just a shade below, there's no huge difference between them. But you might argue that at least there, this boundary is useful because it helps you figure out who's in greater need of help in the clinic or something like that. So there might be circumstances where we accept and endorse the use of arbitrary boundaries sometimes in life. But we always have to ask, what costs am I getting and what benefits am I getting from the imposition of this bullshit boundary, this arbitrary boundary? In the case of personality tests, it's almost all costs. And that's why I rail against it so strongly. But I think that your example in the forensic scenario, and we can also talk about examples in legal and in clinical, those are good examples too. And they also highlight the fact that in some circumstances, it's okay to have arbitrary boundaries, and in some, it's quite damaging. And in personality, it's one of the most damaging, least helpful areas where you can have arbitrary boundaries.
Yeah, in the clinical world, I mean, even there, though, I mean, many disorders will have a certain time frame, right? So if you want to have a diagnosis of bipolar 1 with mania, you need to have at least 7 consecutive days of manic symptoms or more. And with hypomania, it needs to be at least 4 days. These are arbitrary time frames, but the point of the time frames is kind of almost implicit in what it's saying is for bipolar 2 with a hypomanic episode, it would be, well, it's less time and it doesn't cause the wonderful phrase we use in the clinical world is it doesn't cause significant impairment, whereas mania does cause significant impairment. And the reason that is more broadened is because if I were to have 10 people in my office right now that all carried a diagnosis of bipolar 1, it would all look a little different. And that's why you want those arbitrary. So I would agree with you on that. The other example I was thinking of was BMI, which is an interesting, it's an arbitrary number for global kinds of yardsticks, if you will. But there is a difference between nourished Western industrialized countries and other malnourished or many folks that are malnourished in other parts of the world. That's going to have, it's just a different yardstick. And the whole global aspect of it is maybe less salient as we're finding out, but that's another arbitrary boundary. So, but
yeah, that's another arbitrary boundary. I think for a lot of these things that are connected to physical or psychological health, some people would say, look, okay, these boundaries are arbitrary, but we got to have them because if we didn't have them, then we wouldn't know how to triage, like who to treat first.
Yeah, there's no starting line.
Yeah, and who's in more danger of death by suicide or of death by heart disease. Like, we want to help the people. And so we use these arbitrary boundaries because they help us figure out who needs the most urgent help. Okay, that's a reasonable argument.
Right.
But do you have such an argument for using arbitrary boundaries in personality measurement? No, you don't. You only get the downsides, and you don't have that reasonable retort that I need to figure out who to help because they're in physical or psychological danger. And not only do you not have that reasonable upside, but also it's what you mentioned about putting a person in a box. Like, tell them you're an ENTP, whatever. And now they're like, okay, I can only couple with this kind of person romantically. I can only get this kind of job, whatever. And I can only go live in this kind of place. And so you start to hem in your own life in ways that are based on nonsense. And this actually goes back to something that we talked about at the very beginning. Is this harmless or not? In some ways, when people are just like talking about it and they think it's fun to share the results of the test, it's harmless. But if you start closing off careers to yourself, or closing off cities to live in, or closing off romantic partners, or closing off whatever, it's no longer harmless. It is hemming you in, and you are allowing it to close off potential avenues of happiness and success in your life. And that can be quite dangerous.
Well, and the other thing about this as well is that's really important here is we have other personality measures that are more reliable and more valid that we could be using. We don't need to use the Myers Briggs. Right. We have other ones. And additionally on that, in terms of personality assessment, or measurement, one test does not tell you everything about personality. So
right.
I'm assuming you've given psychological assessment batteries at some point. When you give a psychological assessment, you're giving multiple tests, right? You're giving projectives, you're giving objective measures, you're including it with the cognitive measures, you're giving some self-report measures. I mean, you're not throwing the kitchen sink at someone, unless you're a neuropsychologist, they do that. But but if you're doing a clinical psychological assessment, you're giving a handful of big tests, anywhere from 4 to 8 big measures, and you don't just take one test and say, aha, this is the person. I'm going to tell you your diagnosis, I'm going to tell you your personality traits, and I'm going to tell you. You never do that in isolation. You're always doing it with the juxtaposition of other measures, because you're never going to just get. If you get a very clean, uniform, where each test is telling the same thing, you probably question it. You're always going to have variance, because that's how personality is and that's how people are. And it's the point of how you integrate all of that. So that other notion of, well, I have my letters and this is what kind of job I'm going to get, and this is what kind of relationship, is just absolutely fucking bullshit, because that's not, you're making people into these kind of like 1-2-bit dimensional kinds of entities. And that's just not what we know. And that's not accurate at all.
Right. We're actually exceedingly complex and interesting, rather than just
right.
But so I agree with you that it's really important for us to remember that there are these better tests out there like Hexaco and the Big Five. I mean, if we only had the Myers Briggs, then it would be an open debate whether maybe we should use it, because there's nothing else out there. But if we have things out there that beat it in terms of validity and reliability, then why would you use the lesser one if you have access to the better ones? And they're free. They're available on the web for free, these Hexaco and the Big Five. There is something I wanted to add too, which is, you said you give people a battery of tests, and you don't just rely on one test given one time, you rely on a variety of tests. You also give the test multiple times, right? Because we all know that a particularly bad day or a particularly good breakfast or bad breakfast, or sunny out, it's not sunny out or whatever, is going to, you just heard your favorite song or whatever, you didn't hear your favorite song, is going to affect how you feel that day. And so just like we don't measure a student's performance via one question on one exam, you measure it via multiple different exams with multiple different questions and an oral presentation. You don't measure a soccer player's performance via one kick, you measure it over a whole season. What you do with personality is you measure it multiple different times, and then you aggregate or average the results from those different times. And that helps you get closer to an accurate representation of their personality. It helps you to remove the random variance. But if you do something like the Myers Briggs, even if you were to take that multiple times, you'd end up with your different letters each time. It's not easy to average those letters. But if you take the Big Five or Hexaco and you find, this time I was 80% on openness experience, this time I was 84, and this time I was 76, you can now average those three pretty easily.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm just agreeing with you about the battery of tests, and also stressing that if we really want an accurate representation of personality, we give it multiple times and then average the results.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe just say about how Myers-Briggs, kind of whether intentionally or not, tells about how kind of sort of misleading about the big differences kind of between types and then the small differences within type.
Right. I think that's probably unintentional, but as soon as you place people into categories, you have this notion that everybody who's in one category kind of shares a core. They kind of share a key quality that, like, basically all introverts, some might be more introverted than others, but at least they all belong together in the box called introvert. And then all extroverts, some might be more extreme than others, but at least they all belong together in the box called extrovert. And we kind of touched on this earlier when we were saying that if you have an extrovert who just barely made it into the extrovert category, that person is very different than an extreme extrovert. And if you have an introvert who just barely made it into the introvert category, that person is very different than an extreme introvert. And in addition to that, the barely made it introvert and the barely made it extrovert are actually very similar to one another. And their scores are quite similar, their behavior is quite similar, and they are not similar to the extreme scorers in their own category. And so this is one of the issues with the Myers-Briggs, is that by placing people into boxes rather than keeping the continuum, it leads to this key error, that it makes the two borderlines seem very different. They fall into different categories, even though they're very similar. And it makes each borderline seem reasonably similar to his or her own extreme score in their category, even though each borderline person, like that is to say, borderline introvert is quite different from the extreme introvert, and borderline extrovert is quite different from the extreme extrovert. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one other piece it's super important is that when you take all this continuous aspects that we've been saying about personality and humans, and you just try to put it in these buckets, well, you're then not looking at the rich data that you're ignoring or you're throwing away, or and that's one of the, I think maybe the collateral damage of doing this is, well, you're not looking at all of these other aspects.
Right. I mean, you're literally, in a sense, you're discarding information because you're going from the more precise, which is the person's exact extroversion score, the person's exact height. And then you're saying, forget all that nuance. I'm just going to shove them into the box of short, medium, or tall, or shove them into the box of extroverted, introverted. So you go from more precise info to less precise info. So there's a sense in which you're discarding information. Now, there have been people who have pointed out, and I think this is a reasonable thing to point out, that, look, you're not really throwing away the information, because let's say you have a data set and your data set lists the person's actual height, and then you're going to put people into short, medium, or tall. You're not going to throw away the column of their actual height. You're still going to have it there. You've merely now added a label of short, medium, or tall. Or for the extroversion, introversion example, you have their exact score, and then you apply a label. I'm going to call this person extroverted. I'm going to call this person introverted. But you're not going to throw away the column of data that had their exact score. So you're not really throwing away information. And that's a fair thing to say. But in reality, though, it's what comes next? What is the step that comes right after that? And what comes next is, it is the new column of data that says introverted, extroverted, that is used for everything else. That's what's used for matchmaking. That's what's used for hiring. That's what's used for promotion. That's what's used for any next step that you might do, is using the reduced information. It's using the less precise. So I have heard some people say, and I acknowledge the reasonableness of this, is that you're not throwing away the old data, you're just applying a label to it. That's true, but you're throwing it away in all the senses that matter, which is that when you now decide to do hiring or matchmaking or whatever, what do you use for that? You use the most recent thing, which is the categorical label, which is the one that involves the information loss.
Yeah. And then the final reason you give is that it doesn't look at neuroticism, and that's super important, which we talked about with the big five and stuff. So maybe you can just say, like, again, what neuroticism is, and then why that's important. Like, why to exclude that or to not include it in how you're measuring personality is a big blind spot.
Yeah. So neuroticism is often thought of as the negative emotion personality dimension. It's people who are higher in neuroticism experience more episodes of negative emotion. Those episodes last longer and they are more intense. So it's the frequency, intensity, and duration of your negative emotions. People who are higher in neuroticism feel more vulnerable, anxious, depressed, sad, etc. And neuroticism is important because it's linked to a lot of things. It's linked to likelihood of having a psychological disorder or getting treatment at some point. It's actually linked to worse physical health, not just psychological health. It's linked to, it's a predictor of relationship dissatisfaction and relationship dissolution, so breakup. And people who are more neurotic are more vigilant about danger in the world, which that can be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends whether you find yourself in a very dangerous environment, right? If you're in a very dangerous environment, being very vigilant about danger is actually quite a good thing.
Right.
So there are studies on animals' neuroticism or fearfulness or boldness. And when there are more predators around, it pays to be more neurotic. It pays to be more vigilant about danger when there are more dangers around. So neuroticism is connected to all of these things, some of which may be good or bad, depending on what environment or context you find yourself in. But either way, it's connected to very important life outcomes. And it is found all over the world in our species, and it's found in other species as well. So it's a critical thing to measure if you care about predicting these life outcomes that most of us care about, like romantic relationships and careers and psychological health and physical health. So we should measure it. The Big Five measures it. Hexaco, which is another common, widespread, quite good personality test, also measures it, and so do other personality tests. One of the only personality tests that doesn't measure it is the Myers Briggs. And that leads to a major decrement in predictive validity for the Myers Briggs. Is one of the reasons why it's not very good at predicting outcomes, is because it ignores this super key variable. And then comes the question, why do they ignore it? And it's difficult to say with certainty or to read people's minds, but one reasonable thing that we have mentioned briefly is maybe they ignore neuroticism because it's not palatable to tell your customers that you are high in this personality trait that doesn't bode well for certain life outcomes, that predicts negative life outcomes. And so if you skip telling people bad things, maybe you'll have a bigger audience to take your test and to like your test. In fact, if you look at the 16 different personality types yielded by the Myers Briggs, they all sound great. All of them are fantastic. Yeah. They all sound super positive.
Oh yeah.
It's like there's no way you would read any one of them and be disappointed, which is nice for, feeling warm and fuzzy inside, but not so nice if you're trying to figure stuff out about yourself or about your life.
Yeah. So I guess with all that being said, I mean, and this is, of course I'll link your piece in the notes of the episode, but why do people keep believing this? Why do employers keep, using this? And, why do we keep doing that? Is it just, confirmation bias? We just want to think nice things about ourselves. Why don't we just toss this and just be like, look, we got other measures out there that are inexpensive or free, easy to use, et cetera. They have more validity, reliability. Like, why are we still, doing the equivalent of, the fact that, you're a Leo or a Taurus or an Aries or a Capricorn. That's literally, kind of how it feels like, why are we still playing around with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer for sure, but in the piece, I put forward a few possibilities. One possibility is they really have a lot of brand name recognition and great advertising and marketing and money to back the test, which really helps with staying power and spreading power. And another reason might be that, there's some evidence that we are cognitively disposed to think in terms of dichotomies and dualisms rather than continua. It's a lot easier to think light and dark, good and bad, tall and short, than it is to think about this complex continuum with an infinite number of points on it. And actually, it's not just one continuum, it's 5 continua, because there's the openness continuum and the conscientious one and the extroversion one. And so it's probably easier, less cognitively taxing, and maybe also more cognitively natural for us to think in terms of dichotomies and dualisms rather than complex continua with infinite number of points on them and so on. And then there's also what we just said, which is not telling the customer anything negative, not telling anybody anything that will bum them out is probably pretty helpful too, in terms of staying power for the Myers Briggs. And another thing that comes to mind is you mentioned confirmation bias. I think that the Myers Briggs and astrological stuff, horoscopes, they are written in a way that they involve, or they appear to involve, Barnum statements, that they look like they don't say much of substance, but they're written in just the right way so that despite being vague, they lure you into thinking that they're saying quite a lot about you, and you're able to read yourself into them quite well. Yeah. There are some cool studies showing that if you give people horoscopes, for example, and you give them the wrong horoscopes based on their birthday, they'll still read them and think it describes them pretty well. And then they'll be shocked when you inform them that I gave you the wrong horoscope. But they're written quite cleverly to draw you in with just the right amount of ambiguity so that you think, wow, this describes me really well. And, one possible reason is maybe that's what's going on with the way that some of these personality results are written from the Myers-Briggs. So, these are unfortunate reasons that give it sticking power or staying power, at least hypothesized reasons. I don't know for sure if that's true, but those are my guesses. But I do think that, as you said, for people who are thinking, what kind of personality test should I take? I like self-knowledge. I like self-discovery. I want to know more about myself. Maybe I want to know what kind of situations I would do well in or do poorly in. the first thing to realize is that there are better tests out there, and some of them are free, like the Big Five and Hexaco can be gotten for free online, and they will give you a more reliable and a more valid picture of your personality. And then the second thing to appreciate is that there is no test out there that is perfect. There is no test out there that's error-free. You should never take the results of a test so strongly and at such face value that you close off career options or city options or partner options, because all of these tests have error baked into them unavoidably, inextricably. And I might mention one or two other little tidbits, which is that given that everybody shifts a bit from day to day or week to week based on context, any test that you take, like the Big Five or Hexaco, you should take it multiple times over the course of weeks or months or years, and then try to average those results, because that's more accurate than a snapshot of you at any given time. Mm-hmm. And then there is one other thing that I would mention, which is that all of this stuff, like we've been talking about the Myers Briggs, and we've been talking about tests that are better than the Myers Briggs at measuring traits like Hexaco and the Big Five. But then there's also really great personality analyses out there that suggest that all of this is incomplete, including the Big Five and the Hexaco. They are missing certain traits, and above and beyond that, traits themselves are not the entire picture of human personality. There's other stuff beyond that. So one of my favorite papers on the subject is by Dan McAdams, and it's called "What Do We Know When We Know a Person?" which I think is a great title for a paper. What do we know when we know a person? And it provides, it's beautifully written, and it provides an analysis that suggests that the Big Five and Hexaco and other tests for measuring your traits are super important, but they're only step one in truly understanding human personality. Mm-hmm. They are a foundation, but they're not the whole thing. And he provides a really cool analysis of what is missing, or what else is there that's part of human personality that cannot be captured by even the better ones of these tests. So even the non-Myers Briggs, but the better ones. So just for anybody who's listening who's interested in that paper, "What Do We Know When We Know a Person," is very cool.
Yeah, no, that's great. I guess the final question I have on this is, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts since we've been talking a little bit about it, is you first kind of have to know what it is, but we have a few things we know for sure, but I think a big question is that people will have is, does personality change? Can your personality change? Or is it fairly stable, static, and there are other things that change? Your beliefs, your values, opinions, behaviors, actions, environment, that all changes, but the core of your personality is the constant. That's what personalities and temperament, that's what makes you, the uniqueness of you, and everything else is more malleable, but personality doesn't really change. What are your kind of thoughts about that? Yes, no, something else, alternative? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd give a mixed and balanced answer, or at least I would try to, which is that personality is relatively stable. Our personality dispositions are relatively stable, but they do nonetheless change a bit for some of us, and for some of us, they change more. For one thing, certain kinds of big events in your life, like losing everything in your career, or getting promoted many times and making it to the top of your career, or going through trauma or war, or other very big things, can result in personality change. Right. Then there's also the fact that studies suggest that most people's personality changes slightly as they age and become more mature. For example, our neuroticism tends to decline with age, our extroversion tends to decline with age, our openness to experience tends to decline with age. Those are relatively small changes, but they're changes nonetheless, which I think that's useful for highlighting that there is quite some stability to our personality, but also some change. And one way of thinking about it has to do with rank order stability, which is that if I might change in my personality over the next 10 years, and you might change in your personality a bit over the next 10 years. But if right now I'm more neurotic than you and you're more extroverted than me, and we both change a bit over the next 10 years, most likely if we check in with each other in 10 years, I'll still be more neurotic than you and you'll still be more extroverted than me. Mm-hmm. That's the notion of relative position stability, or rank order stability, which is that our position relative to one another, or our ranked order relative to one another, remains quite stable, even if our actual levels of the trait change over time. So that's important because that's one form of stability that even while there's another form of change that's happening. And then I think there are some people who study personality change. And in fact, there's a book that either just came out or is coming out soon by Christian Jarrett on personality change. So I'm sure he would have a lot to say on that. But I guess the point I would try to make is that it is a mixture in the sense that there is some change, but it's for most people not drastic. And I would also say that what is the nature of the stability or the change? It is possible for us to change in our levels of a trait, but remain stable in our rank order or our relative position relative to one another. And so those are important things to keep in mind. But I guess the overall picture then would be pretty stable, but with nonetheless some changes that do happen.
Yeah, that's more or less. I mean, you said it obviously much more eloquently than I would, but that's more or less where I fall as well. I more or less, obviously, barring any of the other, big thing, war, displacement or trauma, but relatively stable. Obviously, there's some studies that have shown that there's, as you get older, openness to experience decreases, right? Or there's certain things where, and that's been shown cross-culturally. And so, but more or less the kind of the core suite of your personality is pretty stable, more or less, barring any big events or factors.
Right.
Well, I mean, we've talked about two big issues, but in some ways it feels like a warm up. But I think it's a good place to stop. We didn't talk about a little bit, but we didn't talk about emotion. We didn't talk about the specific types. I would love to hear your ideas about religion and cultural evolution, and there's so many things. So it's just a good excuse to have you come back on and do another 3 hours. So so you've been super generous with your time, Laith. Tell listeners where they can find you, where they can read your stuff, and anywhere else where they can get at you.
Oh yeah, thanks. Well, you can find my website at the University of Colorado Springs, where if you just type my name is Laith Al-Shawaf, they'll probably put that out there spelled for people to find it. So you can find me at the University of Colorado. You can also find me on Twitter, where my handle is at Laith Al-Shawaf. And you can also find my website, which is www.laithalshawaf.com. And I'm not sure if I'll get a chance to send that stuff your way, just so that people.
Yeah, I'll put all that in the notes. Well, again, I mean, seriously, like, this was so much fun. You're terribly good at explaining things that are complex and have a lot of misconceptions. And what's interesting is that I know that's not entirely exclusively kind of your research, which is even more impressive. And so talking about emotions at a different point would be great. And so
that would be great. I would love that.
Yeah, but this was fun. This was a blast. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Same here. Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course. All right. Thank you, man.